Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, President Trump cancels travel as he weighs his next moves on Iran.
This is not good timing for me. I have a thing called Iran and other things.
Who he's meeting with as he tries to secure a deal.
And tracking an outbreak.
The outbreaks of Ebola and hantavirus in the past 2 weeks show why international threats need an international response.
The WHO says Ebola poses a very high risk in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as suspected cases triple in a week.
Plus summer sticker shock.
We could see that $5 sign by July 4, and who knows, if Americans don't slow down at $5, we could see $6 by Labor Day.
How the Iran war is pushing prices at the pump to their highest levels in nearly 4 years.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm David Gura, alongside Lisa Mateo on this Saturday, May the 23rd. Welcome to all of you, viewers and listeners on all our Bloomberg platforms, on radio, TV, at Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app. A busy morning this morning, a lot of focus on Washington, what may be coming out of the Capitol over the course of the weekend.
And what's not going through the Strait still. We're still
yes.
Status quo there, and what we're going to do about it. But first, let's go to Lisa for the headlines.
You got in this news coming in. A gas explosion at a coal mine in China's northern province of Shanxi has killed at least 90 people. State media says the accident had happened Friday evening. Nearly 250 workers were on duty at the time. Many were hurt by toxic gas. The cause of this explosion is under investigation. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for an all-out effort to rescue those still missing. Some 40,000 people were evacuated under evacuation orders in Southern California after a chemical tank leak. Now, that tank, it's located in an aerospace plastics facility in Garden Grove, and it holds between 6,000 and 7,000 gallons of hazardous chemical. No injuries or deaths have been reported. In New York, one person has died after a fire and 2 explosions on a barge at a commercial shipyard on Staten Island. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani said more than 35 people were injured, most of them firefighters and other first responders.
I want to express my gratitude to every first responder who rushed to the scene. As the fire grew, first responders did what they always do. They ran towards danger so others could escape to safety.
Officials say an investigation is underway. Well, President Trump was at an event in Suffern, New York yesterday, a suburb represented by Mike Lawler, who is seeking re-election in the House in November's midterms. The president said crime and taxes are leading to an exodus of businesses and taxpayers from the state.
Companies are leaving, rich people are leaving, people that pay a lot of money, all these rich companies, big, fat, beautiful companies, they have jobs and they have money and they're leaving and nobody's stopping them from leaving.
The Federal Reserve has a new chair. Kevin Warsh was sworn in yesterday at the White House.
I will lead a reform-oriented Federal Reserve, learning from past successes and mistakes both, escaping static frameworks and models, and upholding clear standards of integrity and performance.
President Trump oversaw the ceremony and stressed that the nation's central bank would remain independent.
Honestly, I really mean this. This is not said in any other way. I want Kevin to be totally independent. I want him to be independent and just do a great job. Don't look at me. Don't look at anybody. Just do your own thing and do a great job.
And Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in India for a multi-day visit. The State Department says Rubio's trip is going to focus on energy, security, trade, and defense cooperation. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. You're used to these trips the Secretary takes, these kind of whirlwind Sweden to India in a weekend.
It's really, I mean, it's great for the passport stamps, but very bad for your mental health because there's no sleep and you don't know what time zone you're in. And but, you know, get to see a lot of cool places.
See what comes out of it.
All
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. This morning, President Trump is waking up in Washington. That's notable because he's not at Bedminster as originally planned, nor is he in the Bahamas for his son's wedding. He posted, quote, "While I very much wanted to be with my son, Don Jr., and the newest member of the Trump family, his soon-to-be wife, Bettina, circumstances pertaining to government and my love for the United States of America do not allow me to do so. I feel it is important for me to remain in Washington, D.C. at the White House during this important period of time."
Well, we don't know why this is an especially important period of time, but we do know President Trump met with Pentagon officials yesterday. The New York Times is reporting the president had an Oval Office meeting with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in which they reportedly discussed options for potentially resuming a bombing campaign in Iran. Bloomberg News White House correspondent Kate Sullivan also had to change her travel plans for the weekend. She, too, is in Washington, not in Bedminster. Very grateful to have you with us this weekend, Kate. Let's start with Iran and the latest there. The ceasefire has been in place for about 6 weeks. Now we've heard varying comments from the president over the course of that 6-week period. The back and forth continues between the U.S. and Iran through this Pakistani intermediary. Pakistani field marshal was in Tehran yesterday. Where do things stand, and does it feel like we're approaching a moment where something is potentially going to change?
That's right. It certainly does not feel that way. So mediators are in Tehran. The president, of course, said that he held off on strikes earlier this week because he was really urged by allies, Gulf allies, to do so, and who had told him that there was really, serious negotiations underway, that there was progress being made. It's really unclear whether that is actually happening. We saw comments from the Ayatollah this week or spoke to Reuters saying that they would not hand over the highly enriched uranium. This is after Trump has been saying for a long time that is a key point. That is something that, he wants Iran to hand over that highly enriched uranium. They want to take it out. He even spoke, in some detail to reporters about how they would go in together after the hostilities ended, and so we're just seeing a lot of and as we have been for weeks, just a lot of conflicting messages about where we actually stand, what progress is being made, and really what the other side has agreed to. So right now we're just really in a holding pattern, as we have been for weeks now, frankly. And I think what's different about now is the president said he held off on these strikes. He also said he gave sort of a loose deadline when he spoke to reporters. He said, maybe I'll give them until Friday or Saturday or Sunday or early next week. So we're sort of tracking a kind of loose early next week deadline for Iran to get back to the United States about potentially, a counter offer. But the last couple of counter offers we've seen, Trump has just completely discarded them and said they were non-starters.
And to your point, it doesn't seem like these two parties are any closer on the deal breakers. They haven't moved on the really big things. The other big thing is, of course, that the Strait is still closed, and our commodities columnist Javier Blas has a column out this week talking about there could be a reality that the Strait does not open for quite a while, talking about how the Suez was shut down for years during that conflict, so much so that the boats actually rusted waiting to go through. Is this a reality that you think the White House is willing or ready to face? Are they planning a contingency plan for this, or for the other alternative, which is you now have this possible negotiation with Iran and Oman trying to create a permanent toll system through the Strait if it does open?
Yeah, it's a great question. I asked the president about this a few weeks ago about whether he would be okay with, and he's been asked several times, but what he told me was that there would absolutely not, that he would not be okay with a kind of toll system or any kind of restrictions or the Iranians really controlling anything about the Strait. He said basically that the only thing he would accept is it completely opening. But again, when we think about the reality here, it's really unclear whether that is going to be feasible, or even if it does open. I think now the fear is that Iran could just close it at any time, that this is a point of leverage now for them, something that they've realized that they have a lot of control over. I think, the president has said that he will not lift the naval blockade. That's something that Iran needs, or says that they need, in order to open the Strait. He says that under no circumstances will he lift the blockade unless a peace deal is finalized and there's something that is signed and done. So it seems with everything with this war, I think it's really interesting. The president, I think his top advisors are saying, this is a huge concern for the midterms. Gas prices are so high. This war is very unpopular. But we heard the president this week say, essentially, everyone is telling me that this war is unpopular. He acknowledged that. He said that, people are saying that this war is unpopular, but I think it's actually more popular than it is. And there seems to be sort of a digging in by the president saying, I think this is important enough to continue. And we're seeing that in a lot of ways, as this drags on and as gas prices get higher and higher and more, there's more anxiety heading into the midterms. The president seems to say this is worth it for him.
Kate, Christina and I were both on the terrace here at Bloomberg yesterday looking to the skies to see if we could see those ospreys carrying you and the other reporters and President Trump to Rockland County for this event that he did for Mike Lawler, the congressman in upstate New York. You were there for that event. I was wondering before we spoke with you this morning how much Congressman Lawler wanted the president to be there. He said, you know, if the president says he's coming to your district, you have him come to your district. But he is in a tenuous and difficult position here, the congressman, trying to hold on to that seat, which is heavily contested. What did you make of the comments from the president last night and the kind of welcome and reception that he got there in Rockland County?
Yeah, it was interesting because Kamala Harris won that district. Lawler is facing a really tough re-election fight. He's a very vulnerable House Republican. I think, you know, what I felt like I saw from the president yesterday was him sort of trying to test out his midterm messaging, trying to really focus on the things that his advisors and allies have asked him to focus on, which is really domestic issues, the economy. He talked about SALT. There was a lot of, you know, it seemed like we heard sort of a preview of what we're going to hear a lot of from the president as we head into the midterms, as he starts traveling more and getting out onto the road. I think the president also, frankly, just, you know, I covered his 2024 campaign and ended up going to more than 200 rallies, you know, and it was, I think he does enjoy being out on the road and giving these speeches. And I'll also note that it was interesting, and perhaps it was just New York, but there were several protesters at different points in the speech who were escorted out. I don't remember the last time that I saw that many protesters at different times being escorted out. But in terms of, you know, the president's speech, he really tried to focus on the domestic issues and less on Iran, which is something that I think a lot of the people who are in his base really want him to be focusing on at this moment.
All right, Kate Sullivan, White House correspondent for Bloomberg. We're going to talk to you more about those domestic issues when you join us later in the show. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Well, funerals and large gatherings are now suspended in the northeast of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as authorities track a new Ebola outbreak there. The WHO says this outbreak now poses a high risk for the country, but the risk of the disease spreading globally remains low.
The WHO, alongside researchers at Imperial London College, also believe the Ebola outbreak may be substantially larger than officially detected. Joining us now from Melbourne, Australia, is Bloomberg senior editor for global health and medical science, Jason Gale. Thank you for making the time. What is it about this outbreak? I mean, you write in your column that they were expecting an outbreak, but not this one. Why not this strain, and why not at this time? Why is this so dangerous?
Really, it's because of the fact that this is actually a rare strain of Ebola. Bundibugyo has only turned up twice that we know of since 2007. Both times, the cumulative number of cases was fewer than 200. So experts were predicting the next Ebola outbreak would more likely be the Zaire strain that caused the devastating outbreak in West Africa just over a decade ago. And so this one wasn't on anyone's radar.
I want to ask you, you quote Dr. Craig Spencer in your piece, and those of us who've lived in New York for a while remember when he, a doctor who was based here, came back from Africa carrying Ebola and the kind of fracas that caused here in the city. I remember there was a bowling alley in Brooklyn that closed down. There was a lot of agita just surrounding him being here and having a positive case here in the United States. He now is at Brown University continuing to study this disease. What did he say about the response to this one compared to what we saw back in 2014 and 2016? How are the circumstances surrounding this one different, both in terms of the epidemiological side of things and also just the public health response?
Yeah, so we know that with this particular strain, Bundibugyo, there is no approved treatment or vaccine. So unlike Zaire, that the world had been sort of practicing in countering with vaccines and monoclonal antibody therapies, here we have nothing like that. We're going back to where we were in 2014, just with supportive care. So from that perspective, it's kind of really just devastating. But also because many of the mechanisms that we had in place to try to arrest these outbreaks quickly, to get on top of them, have been kind of wound back through aid cuts, for example, cuts to the CDC, research being pared back at the NIH. So on that level too, it's also very disappointing.
Yeah, you have another quote from Dr. Spencer about that exact thing in your piece, saying, the deeper frustration is the sense that the world keeps repeating the same cycle of panic and neglect. We've put together, torn down the infrastructure that we need to do all this in the span of a decade. Talk to us about how big of a deal it is there's been a lot of cuts across the board globally to NGOs, but especially the dissolution of USAID and what kind of a difference that made, even if it's not medical personnel, just eyes on the ground, logistics, people in villages noticing things that they can report back, like really basic things are not happening.
Yeah, exactly. Contact tracing, that's, finding out all of the people that infected people were in contact with, and then checking them, testing them, isolating them, making sure that they aren't infected and then spreading it on. That work was largely done by USAID officials. And of course, that organization is no longer running. So there is a big hole there. The US is, of course, withdrawn from the World Health Organization. So this UN body has lost its biggest donor and has had to pare back on a lot of its programs around the world. So we're seeing this all sort of coming to roost.
Jason, last question here is just about the U.S.'s response. And my inbox this week has been flooded with emails from the State Department emphasizing all that the U.S. government is doing, noting that the CDC is kind of running point here. And I kind of catalog here what the CDC has said, that the public health screenings for those arriving from areas affected by Ebola here in the U.S., they're coordinating with airlines, they're enhancing port protection, deploying CDC personnel for outbreak containment, really emphasizing the fact that their goal here is not to have any Ebola cases here in the United States. How do you assess the work that the U.S. government is doing? Again, drawing that contrast back to 2014, 2016, how radically different is it?
Well, for one thing, Tom Frieden, when he was the CDC director back 10 years ago, Ebola in West Africa was a full-time job for him, I'm told. At the moment in the CDC, we have a part-time director. So, I think that's pretty telling. There are so many parts of the U.S. Health and Human Services bureaucracy that are missing. There's no Surgeon General. There's no FDA commissioner. Like, if you go through the list, there are a lot of pieces missing. And while sure, the State Department is saying that they've got all people on the ground, reporting, I think, by the New York Times is suggesting that many of those jobs that are ostensibly, on the ground in DRC are actually vacant.
Yeah.
Jason, appreciate the time, especially on Saturday night for you down there in Australia. Very grateful for that. That's Jason Gale, author of the book After COVID, The Health Impacts That Will Last Generations, a medical and science editor for us here at Bloomberg News. Be sure to read Jason's weekend essay right now at Bloomberg.com.
All right, and coming up, Memorial Day weekend. Coming in with some pain for holiday travelers. How much more it's going to cost you to hit the road or the skies. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. The World Health Organization said that the Ebola outbreak now poses a, quote, very high risk for Congo. That's up from the previous categorization of high, but adds that the risk of the disease spreading globally remains low. Yesterday, authorities in northeastern Congo, they banned funeral wakes and gatherings of more than 50 people to curb the outbreak. Foreigners seeking permanent residency in the U.S., well, they'll now have to leave the country to apply for green cards. The surprise change by the Trump administration to a long-standing policy is sparking concern and confusion among aid groups, immigration lawyers, and immigrants. They say requiring people to travel abroad could leave many stranded for weeks, months, or even years in backlogged appointment systems. A federal judge in Tennessee dismissed human smuggling charges against Salvadorian migrant Kilmar Abrego Garcia after concluding the U.S. government brought the case in retaliation for his legal fight against being deported. The human smuggling case that was filed after a court ordered Abrego Garcia returned to the U.S. Tulsi Gabbard resigning as Director of National Intelligence, her husband battling cancer. Gabbard was an outspoken critic of interventions and had largely been sidelined from President Trump's national security team. Her last day will be June 30th. And SpaceX's Starship blasted off from the southern tip of Texas. Despite some engine trouble, it reached its final destination, splashing down in the Indian Ocean. David and Christina comes just 2 days. Elon Musk said that he's taking the company public. So, yeah.
Talk to Lauren Grosh about this a little bit later in the show, but I mean, it is a spectacular. You said you used to cover, as a reporter in Texas, this part of Texas, which is now this kind of space, not space coast, obviously.
Yes, there's nothing there in this town. Like when I was there 10 years ago, there was nothing there, and it's about to, after this IPO hits, potentially have this huge boom. It's one of these desolate former towns where you can see tumbleweeds kind of rolling around, and now it's going to be
center of attention.
I was reading they've now got like French cafes and shopping districts. So now maybe it's
to go back.
Should go back. All right.
Thank you, Lisa.
On that note, thanks, Lisa. Well, we won't be going back there for Memorial Day. We actually won't be traveling. But nearly 45 million people are expected to hit the road this weekend. That's according to AAA. The holiday, of course, marks the official, unofficial start of the summer travel season. But drivers in all 50 states are paying significantly more at the pump than they were just weeks ago.
There's also growing concern prices could climb even higher as the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz continues to disrupt global energy markets. According to analysts at GasBuddy, if the strait were to remain closed much longer, gas prices could spike to $5 a gallon.
We spoke with Patrick Haan. He's GasBuddy's head of petroleum analysis, and Clint Henderson, who's at The Point Sky. He's their managing editor. And we started with Patrick asking about that $5 a gallon and if that could really happen this summer if the strait doesn't open.
Well, certainly looking like that is a stronger and stronger possibility as we're now 82 days into what's happened between the U.S. and Iran. The strait has remained blocked, and millions of barrels of oil every day are not traveling through the strait that normally would. And that is going to continue to be very impactful more moving forward, especially in the summer as demand for gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel goes up. All the products derived from oil are certainly sorely needed. Global inventories are declining, and that means that the longer the Strait of Hormuz continues to be closed, we could see an elevated risk of the national average reaching the $5 a gallon mark, something we've only seen for less than a week back in 2022.
Patrick, I want to ask you about something that the governor of California posted. Gavin Newsom started a bit of a kerfuffle. He posted, Californians, if you're hitting the road this holiday weekend, be sure to avoid Chevron. He told them to fill up at unbranded gas stations instead. This is because Chevron, as he put it, criticized his policies in the state and blamed them for higher prices. What do we make of this? We know that California is this crucible where prices seem to be a lot higher than other states.
I think any credible analyst would say that California's played a major role in gas prices being elevated. I mean, make no mistake, when your gas is $6 a gallon, there's a heavy influence when nobody else in the country is seeing gas prices like California. So I think there's a lot to be said that politicians have steered California's gas prices up by having things like cap and trade, a low carbon fuel standard, the nation's highest gasoline taxes, and very stringent regulations when it comes to operating refineries. I mean, look at Texas. You compare the two, it's very, type of gasoline is very similar. It's not like Texas is a different state where economics doesn't work. A lot of what happens in California is really impacted by political rule from the last 10, 15, even 20 years.
Clint, I want to ask you, despite the high prices, this is supposed to be one of the busiest Memorial Day travel weekends on record. Do you expect to see these prices change behavior when it comes to travel later in the summer? And what is the tipping point for when people just say, forget it, I'm just a staycation for me, I can't afford it?
Yeah, we're getting there. I think so far the consumer has been remarkably resilient. In fact, we're seeing, as you mentioned, record-breaking demand. But I think we're close to that breaking point now. We just got new polls in the field from YouGov. I was just looking at them, and 32% of those we polled said if prices continue to rise, they may scale back their summer plans. So I think we're right at the edge there. But look, the airlines have been raising baggage fees. They've raised ticket prices over and over again. We're looking at summer airfare up between 20 and 30%. So far, that's not impacting bookings, but I have a feeling that's going to change if this continues.
It's impacting my bookings. You guys keep nagging. It's becoming a running joke. You guys keep nagging on me to take a break. And every time I Google prices, I go, nope. Sorry, go ahead.
Let me tease a bit more out of that, Clint, because I think since the last time we spoke, we saw Spirit Airlines go out of business, and that kind of made us newly aware of the pressure a lot of these airlines are under. Through the polling that you've seen, through what you've heard from airlines, how acute is the pain that they're facing, and how much has that been compounded by the energy crisis we've seen as a result of the war in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that the U.S. carriers are a little more insulated. Delta has a refinery, but also they've raised prices substantially to take care of some of that hit they're taking on jet fuel prices. But look, that's a huge part of their costs every day. And so, yes, fares are going up. They're raising bag fees across the board. Even Frontier, low-cost carrier, has said that it's raised fares 5 times since the war started, and they're seeing no resistance from consumers. So it's remarkable that people just want to travel. They don't seem to care. But with prices up, 30% for Europe, we're seeing 30 up to 40% higher airfare. It's going to start to change behavior here before too long.
Patrick, beyond just availability and supply and the strait still being closed, are there other factors that you're watching that could push gas prices to that $5 mark or potentially higher?
Well, we talk about things like jet fuel and gasoline, and it's all about refineries right now. Without refineries, we have none of these products. And we just saw a rash of refining issues in the Great Lakes that caused gasoline prices to spike, and causing diesel prices also to spike to new all-time records. So this summer is going to be one where we're focused not just on oil and what's going on with the Strait of Hormuz, but without refineries, we have none of it. So, look for refinery updates. A lot of refineries, by the way, very timely upgrades, including a major upgrade that produces more jet fuel down in Texas. And you're going to see refineries tinkering what they can get out of their refineries. And by the way, that's the interesting development. Jet fuel prices have actually come back a little bit as refineries are heavily incentivized to sacrifice diesel and gasoline production where they can to yield more jet fuel. So, if something happens, major hurricane as we get into hurricane season as well, could be very impactful this summer.
Clint, I think the age-old calculus when you're taking a trip, when a lot of people are taking a trip, is it worth driving? Is it worth flying? That's an economic consideration. It's a time consideration. How is that calculus being shaped at this moment in time because of the rising energy prices that we're seeing? I guess you could make the case probably that it's not as, on some of these shorter trips, not as economical to drive as maybe it was in the past.
Yeah, I think that's true. But the truth is the rising cost of fuel increases prices across the board for everything when it comes to travel. So whether you're taking a road trip or you're trying to stay at a roadside hotel, the costs are going up for food, for transportation, for Uber. It's across the board increases. So it's not like you're going to get a great deal by driving instead of flying in most cases. Either way, you're going to pay more than you were last summer.
All right. You cover points and rewards every day, something I will admit to being very bad at because it requires organization.
You are bad at that?
Yes, I'm terrible. Are you good at points?
Yes, I am.
That surprises me 0%. All right, the disorganized one of us is very bad at points. If you are an adult like David Gura and keep track of these things, is this a good way, a good summer to try to redeem those, to try to defray some of those costs, and where are the places they can be most effective?
Yeah, absolutely. When cash fares are high, you're going to get the most value from your points and miles. And this is what I say to everybody: earn them and burn them. Do not hoard points because they're getting less valuable over time. You've seen this with programs like Delta SkyMiles, where a Delta One flight may have used to cost 80,000 Delta SkyMiles, and now it's 400,000 Delta SkyMiles. And here's what's killing folks right now: that they're adding fuel surcharges on top of award redemptions. So especially if you're flying in and out of London or Paris, you're going to use all your points and you're going to have to pay exorbitant cash copays, which sort of takes some of the value out. So avoid London if you can. That's my best advice. You still find really good deals with points and miles. They are out there, but use them because they're getting less valuable over time.
Patrick, let me throw the last question to you. I just love your broader outlook here for the summer. So we're focused here on the next days and weeks. Obviously, here on the show, we're tracking the back and forth over whether the strait's going to reopen or not. But widening the aperture even further for the rest of the summer, how do you see things playing out here as we get into July and August?
Well, it's do or die. It's really on whether the strait reopens by June or July, and or even August. That'll set the course for gas prices this summer. And it looks to me like after 82 days, there's been very little overall movement. The U.S. seems entrenched. Iran seems entrenched. Both sides seem far apart. Though in the last couple of days, maybe a little bit more promise, but we're still here. And if that entrenchment continues into July 4, I think we're going to see that $5 a gallon price coming out, because overall, the longer the strait remains closed, we've already lost out on over 1.2 billion barrels of oil. If we continue to see that, the U.S. reserves and global reserves are declining rapidly. When those run out, we could see that $5 sign by July 4. And who knows, if Americans don't slow down at $5, we could see $6 by Labor Day. Wow. All of it, though, is very much contingent on something absolutely unpredictable if and when the Strait of Hormuz opens. and we start to see ships going back through it again.
I think a lovely summer vacation walking laps around Central Park is going to sound perfect for me. Yeah. But Patrick Haan and Clint Henderson, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, as many of us weigh those decisions for summer getaways, we are often bombarded with hotel options, and you got to decide if they're going to splurge on a luxury room or go budget friendly.
Well, these days it's getting harder to spot the difference between those two things, as Bloomberg travel columnist Brandon Presser explains.
Can you guess how much this Miami hotel room costs per night? How about this one? Or this one? Hotel rooms are all starting to look the same, and I would know. As a travel reporter, I have visited over 3,000 hotels. Back in the 50s, as air travel took off, hotels used to be all about the novelty of the destinations. They made you feel like you were staying somewhere exciting and new. In the 90s, fashion designers started putting their stamps on hotels, making them feel moody and cool. Corporate consolidation under the big brands like Marriott, Hilton, or Hyatt are a big reason for this movement towards sameness. Actually, these behemoths are everywhere. 65% of luxury hotels around the world are run by corporate chains. Industry insiders told me that design standards work, and in fact, consumers like the familiarity. Using the same playbook across a hotel brand means the big corporations can be more efficient and buy in bulk, saving cash and time. It's something investors love too. We all take shorter trips, and we pack less, which means we need less storage for our stuff. That means rooms can be smaller and simpler, while common spaces, like lobbies, get much more design attention. According to experts, these high-traffic zones are where you see the most financial investment. So it's no wonder that all of these rooms in Miami look so similar.
I kind of like the sameness. I like a comfortable bed, Christina. I like to know what I'm getting.
I will give you, it is nice to know you're getting certain things, but they do all, again, as we travel around the world, they do all feel the same.
All right, coming up here, we're going to talk about SpaceX calling its latest launch a success as Elon Musk's company moves toward an IPO. That's coming up.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week. And I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. NASCAR fans, they are remembering driver Kyle Busch. Now, Busch died 3 days before he was set to run the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. NASCAR CEO Steve O'Donnell says,
I think personally about Kyle Busch and NASCAR. And to me, Kyle Busch just defines what it means to be a racer in NASCAR. Everything about it, the fire, the greatness, the heart that sometimes you rarely saw. The sport was truly lucky to have him.
Cause of death has not been released. Busch was 41 years old. To golf, where the PGA Tour hits TPC Craig Ranch in McKinney, Texas. Siwoo Kim, he tops the leaderboard at 18 under par, followed by a five-way tie for second that includes Americans Scotty Scheffler, Wyndham Clark, and Jackson Suber at 13 under par. Some NHL playoffs action last night. The Vegas Golden Knights, well, they topped the Colorado Avalanche 3-1 in Game 2. Tonight, the Montreal Canadiens take on the Carolina Hurricanes. To basketball now, the Oklahoma City Thunder, well, they beat the San Antonio Spurs 123-108 in Game 3 of the Western Conference Finals last night. The Thunder, they lead the series 2-1. Tonight, it is the night. The New York Knicks take on the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Knicks lead 2-0. You heard that? None. There we go. And Lionel Messi, he has joined the exclusive club of athletes with a net worth above $1 billion. His fortune, well, it's soared through a massive paycheck from Inter Miami, real estate, and stakes in several companies. And that actually puts him alongside his longtime rival guys, Cristiano Ronaldo, too. So they're both kind of in that same
a lot of money.
Space there. It's a lot of money.
So much. You excited about this game? Clearly.
I am. I can't stay up for it, but I'm excited for it.
We'll give you permission.
Thanks.
All right. It's been a heck of a week for SpaceX. The company launched its powerful Starship rocket Friday night after a one-day delay. It was the 12th test flight for the 407-foot rocket, which is meant to someday carry astronauts to the moon and eventually Mars. Starship blasted off from Elon Musk's Starbase in Texas for an hour-long flight to deploy 20 mock satellites into orbit.
It was largely considered a success. Despite some fireworks, the Super Heavy booster fell out of control shortly after liftoff, crashing into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the main Starship returned to Earth about an hour later, splashing down in the Indian Ocean as planned and then bursting into flames. Still, Elon Musk says it was a good day.
Last night's launch follows SpaceX filing publicly for what's likely to be the largest IPO in history. The company hopes to raise as much as $75 billion. It's targeting a $2 trillion valuation. The prospectus SpaceX filed gives us new insight into SpaceX's business and its aspirations. We spoke with Lauren Grush, who covers space for Bloomberg.
What it showed me is just kind of how on paper this company does not appear to match the astronomical numbers that we are hearing around this IPO. You know, we've reported that they potentially will go public at a $2 trillion valuation or something around there. They want to raise tens of billions of dollars. But when you look at the actual raw numbers, you know, this company seems to be losing money. Its launch business wasn't profitable last year. Now, its Starlink internet business, which provides broadband with its satellite constellation around the Earth, you know, that does seem to be growing. It's growing subscribers. It's bringing in more and more revenue each year. But overall, it does not seem to match, you know, the hype that this IPO has been creating.
Astronomical. I see what you did there. Very clever, very clever. But I found this so interesting because, yeah, to your point, you know, targeting a $2 trillion valuation. But when you look at the prospectus, it's the unsexier parts of the company that are doing really well, like Starlink. So are they pivoting at all? Are they leaning into that? Are they still focused on the big shiny space objects when they go to potential stockholders, investors, and say, like, give us this money, this is what we're worth?
I think what a lot of people have noticed, and what I also noticed about this, which is bizarre for me as somebody who's been covering SpaceX for so long, is that SpaceX appears now to be all in on AI. It's more of an AI company than it does seem to be a space company. Now, that being said, its space component is, you know, extremely valuable and important for what it wants to do with this AI sector, right? It's been talking about launching up to 1 million AI data centers in space. And the way that you do that is through launch. So that is still a really critical part of its mission and what it needs to do in order to achieve all of these aspirational goals. And then at the same time, its Starlink business is the one that is proving that it can actually make money from a large constellation of satellites in space. So I think that will ultimately still continue to grow and help to supplement, you know, a lot of these big aspirational goals. But at the same time, it's very clear that the launch part of the business is not the big moneymaker. Still, it's extremely valuable for what they want to do.
Big question here is what this means for the man behind this company, for Elon Musk, and all of the whispers that he'll be the world's first trillionaire. Again, going back to what was filed this week, what did we learn about his compensation, what he's how he's likely to profit or make out from this this IPO when it happens?
Right. So I think that he's, you know, his big pay package is tied to probably one of the most amazing goals you could possibly have as a CEO, which is this idea that you'll get paid when we have up to 1 million residents on a Mars colony.
1 million residents on Mars.
Yeah, I let's just say I'm not sure that is something that Elon will be seeing in his lifetime. I'm happy if you want to bring me back on the show when that is achieved, and I'll say that I'm wrong. I'm happy to do that. That is just an extremely aspirational goal. But you have to admit, you know, this is a prospectus that reads more like science fiction than other prospectuses. So that's fun for us, and it'll be interesting to see just how much they get to that goal moving forward.
But I did want to ask you about that because, I mean, this is serious money and these are serious investors. And when you have someone writing, the other part of that was that he wants a humanity backup plan on this Mars colony, kind of a space ark in case nuclear winter or something happens. I mean, does that frighten investors at all? Like, yes, it's fun and aspirational, but if this is the focus of the man running this company and not the parts of the company that are actually tangible and making money, does that spark any concern?
I think one thing that you could probably take away from what was in this document is that SpaceX does not appear to be very concerned with what I think other companies would be concerned about, which is showing that they're not making money, you know, showing this extreme CapEx, the capital expenditure that they have. I think what they're banking on is kind of the, you know, cult of personality around Elon and the fact that they have this extremely impressive resume with bringing down launch costs, you know, being an extremely valuable launch provider for commercial, the launch marketplace and the US government and even the world. And so I think what they are banking on is having investors remember that past success and how they've been able to dominate the launch market, dominate the space industry, and hoping that people will want to buy in because of that past success and see them replicate that moving forward. So I think if you're going to invest in SpaceX now, it's not because you're hoping to have these short-term gains, in the next year or even in the next 5 years. I think what you're doing now is you're saying, I'm going all in on Elon Musk's vision. And because of what he's achieved in the past, I think he can do it again in the future. And I want to be along for that ride.
So critical to what Elon Musk is proposing there, or the company's proposing there, getting all these people to Mars, is this Starship rocket. Talk about the importance of that to the launch side of the business, figuring out a way to get this to launch reliably in a way that it hasn't been able to so far. Right.
Well, I think you'll notice that in their prospectus, one of their top risk factors is Starship. And like I said earlier, while launch appears on paper to be a small part of this business, is extremely important to what they want to do next. And Starship is basically the backbone of all of these future ambitions. They want to launch these data centers into space. They have to be able to launch on Starship. They want to launch larger versions of their Starlink satellites. Those are specifically designed to launch on Starship. Also, their future direct-to-cell satellites, which connect to unmodified smartphones, they also have to launch on Starship. And so what they detail in their filing is that if Starship doesn't work or if it's majorly delayed, that's going to have a huge ripple effect on all of these major programs. So Starship has to work. They've designed it. They've made it on the critical path for all of their success. And so it has to work in order for all of these things to happen. And so, again, launch may seem small, but in the end, it's the key pivotal point for their future.
Lauren Gresh, thank you very much. You're welcome back anytime before or after Elon Musk gets 1 million people to Mars. Happy to have you on anytime.
Yeah, if you want to zoom in from Mars, that's also fine. Just let us know.
Yeah, no, I'll take the moon, maybe not Mars.
There we go. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura alongside Christina Ruffini. For decades, luxury brands have built their businesses on two things: exclusivity and aspiration.
That's right. Earlier, we spoke with Bloomberg News European luxury retail reporter, which, by the way, is a great job,
Sounds
Angelina
great.
Reskowitz, about how changing tastes and economic uncertainty are actually slowing those sales, as well as Chanel's recent surprising earnings cycle.
We have calculated the dividend payouts for the owners of Chanel since 2017, and that windfall comes up to about $21 billion. So it's very important, it's quite massive, and that 21 billion windfall feeds into the family vehicle, which is called Mousse, and they've invested in different businesses, including notably, for instance, in the US, the fashion brand, the Row.
Oh, interesting. The Row. It is a nice fashion brand. A little out of my bracket most of the time, but we can aspire. But why does this matter? Because Chanel has had a bit of a rough go. I know for a while they really didn't even have an in-house designer. The house of Chanel was making the collections kind of in collaboration. Talk to us about why this is an odd time to be taking out that much money and to pay yourself that big of a dividend. 2025 was a better year for Chanel. They returned to growth after a drop in sales in 2024. Basically, Chanel also suffered the slowdown and then the downturn in demand for luxury goods. After the post-pandemic, there was a boom in luxury goods. People wanted to go out, they wanted to look good, and Chanel enjoyed this. However, there was probably in the last 2 years, there was probably a lack of interest from consumers for Chanel goods because they probably didn't innovate enough. They didn't create products that inspired a lot of desirability. When you talk about the luxury houses in general, to your point, they have had a slowdown. Part of it is because there was just such that extraordinary growth. And you even have the CEO of Yves Saint Laurent this week saying exactly that the growth was extraordinary but not sustainable, and brands need to work harder at retaining aspirational clients and, to your point, making products that people really want. You know, it strikes me there was this bit of a scandal where it turned out some of the bags were being made very cheaply and the markup was very high. There's been a lot of complaints about the quality of these products and what they're charging them for. Is this kind of a turning point for these houses that they need to get back to basics if they want to save their business model as it is?
Absolutely. I think there was a point where brands in the post-pandemic, they got complacent. They probably thought that the sky was the limit. They could increase prices and not see a repercussion or a backlash from consumers. And that actually, that is what happened at some point when, for instance, in the case of Chanel, a classic flap bag about 2 years ago in Paris, it went above the symbolic 10,000 euro level. And so that obviously makes people think twice. And, you know, it's basically the same product, but I can see that the prices are just going up and up. And analysts, they call this greedflation, and some brands were accused of increasing prices too much compared to other ones. And in this category, I think, you know, people agree to say that Chanel was probably one of them, maybe Dior as well, and others. And in order to gain, again, the attention from consumers, there was, in the past 2 years, there was a big creative reshuffle among the top fashion brands, whether that's Christian Dior with Jonathan Henderson, of course, Chanel with Mathieu Blazy.
And he used to be at Bottega, right?
Gucci, Demna.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Sorry,
yes,
I think he used to be at Bottega,
absolutely.
exactly.
He came from Bottega Veneta. Yeah, absolutely. But also Celine and other ones. So basically, you need to show that you need to increase the value perception of your products, and I think that's what the brands would agree on.
One way to get excitement and get new consumers potentially is these drops we're seeing, these collaborations between higher-end brands and slightly more affordable brands. And I wanted to talk to you about this Swatch collab with this very high-end watch brand that I'm going to let you say because I'm going to mess it up, and I know all the watch nerds are going to come for me, including my brother. But they had these pop swatches that literally caused stampedes and frenzies and stores to have to shut because they couldn't deal with this. What was this, and why was it such a big deal, and do you expect to see more of these?
Absolutely. So it was a collaboration between Swatch, you know, mass watches, you know, a big, you know, democratic watch brand, and then Audemars Piguet. And this is probably the top of the pyramid with Rolex and Patek Philippe. Audemars Piguet, just to give you a sense, they produce about 50,000 watches a year. Wow. Versus Swatch, the brand, they produce 4.4 million watches a year. So you've got a mass brand and then a very exclusive brand. It generated mayhem in the run-up. People were camping outside the stores for a couple of days ahead of the sale, which was on Saturday, the 16th of May, and that was across all over the world. And it was in Swatch, you know, stores. It was in physical stores. It wasn't an online. You couldn't buy them online. And the thing is, as you say, we saw scenes of mayhem, of chaos. Sometimes people being sometimes pepper spray because they didn't
fights.
Really,
yeah, they refused to open. Some of the stores didn't even open because they said, we're not engaging in this. We're not opening today. Go home.
I think there was a disappointment in the execution. In the concept, I think it's up for debate. It's probably going to be very positive for Swatch. Swatch, you know, they're suffering because they are the you know, it's a mass brand, and the value right now is in the top of the pyramid, so in the exclusive brand. And for Audemars Piguet, Ilaria Resta, the CEO of Audemars Piguet, she said it's probably going to generate interest again in mechanical watches, which, you know, volumes of mechanical watches have also been falling over the past few years. So that is probably also the positive for Audemars Piguet. But some people will say, actually, Audemars Piguet doesn't need that because it's super exclusive.
Okay.
So we'll have to see in the numbers of Swatch.
And we'll have to see how many people who buy those watches can actually read them, because apparently this is a thing. People can't read analog watches anymore. All right, Angela Reskowitz, she's Bloomberg News European luxury retail reporter. Merci mille fois.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. in New York. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, alongside Lisa Mateo, bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, and analysis live this morning and every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock a.m. And our focus this morning, in part, is on what's happening in Africa, Christina, this Ebola outbreak that continues to widen. And there does seem to be this effort underway to kind of ascertain what facts we actually do know at this point, how long this has been kind of spreading across the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and what the policy response has been in light of the fact that so much of it has been eviscerated in the U.S. at least.
Exactly right. That getting a handle on what's happening has been hampered, in fact, by the fact that you no longer have as many aid workers, not just from the U.S., but especially from USAID, from CDC involved in this process. We're going to break that all down and talk about how much of a threat it is to other nations outside the hot zone right now. But first, we want to go to Lisa Mateo with the headlines.
You got it. In Persian Gulf nations and Pakistan, they are stepping up efforts to push for an Iran peace deal. Now, Pakistani's army chief visited Tehran Friday for discussions on an accord with Iran's foreign minister. And sources telling Bloomberg the United Arab Emirates has joined Qatar and Saudi Arabia in appealing to President Donald Trump to allow more time for negotiations. Meanwhile, Axios and CBS News reported that Trump was preparing for a possible fresh round of strikes. Now, meanwhile, Israel's military hit 2 residential buildings in post-warning strikes in central Gaza, leaving 2 people wounded and major damages. That's according to hospital officials and residents. Now, there were no reported casualties. Meanwhile, yesterday, the president told a rally in New York the war will be over soon. He also talked about taxes in the state.
New York can never be the same if it's losing its tax base, and the people that pay 85% of the taxes are leaving. And we're taking in illegal immigrants, so they're wonderful people and all, but they're not paying any tax. They're taking your money.
The Federal Reserve has a new chair. Kevin Warsh was sworn in yesterday at the White House.
I will lead a reform-oriented Federal Reserve, learning from past successes and mistakes both, escaping static frameworks and models, and upholding clear standards of integrity and performance.
Now, President Trump oversaw the ceremony and stressed that the nation's central bank would remain independent.
Honestly, I really mean this. This is not said in any other way. I want Kevin to be totally independent. I want him to be independent and just do a great job. Don't look at me. Don't look at anybody. Just do your own thing and do a great job.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio in India for a multi-day visit. The State Department says Rubio's trip will focus on energy security, trade, and defense cooperation. Rubio already met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi today. And the U.S. ambassador to India posting on social media that Rubio has extended an invite to visit the White House in the future. And foreigners seeking permanent residency in the U.S. will now have to leave the country to apply for green cards. The surprise change by the Trump administration to a long-standing policy, well, it's sparking concern and confusion among groups like immigration lawyers as well as immigrants. Now, they say requiring people to travel abroad could leave many stranded for weeks, months, or even years in backlogged appointment systems as well. David and Christina.
It's really strange because normally when you're applying for a green card, you can't leave the country.
Right,
That's the whole thing. You have to stay while that process is going through. I have a friend who's going through it right now, and she's a big travel bug, and she's frustrated that she can't leave, but this is the complete opposite of that.
You have to go to the country.
More confusion, more policy confusion. Lisa, thank you very much.
All right, an Ebola outbreak in Central Africa is suspected to have killed 176 people, and there are about 830 suspected and confirmed cases of the deadly disease. But the head of the World Health Organization says the scale of the epidemic in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is much larger. The U.S. officially withdrew from the WHO in January, and experts say the public health response to the outbreak has been adversely impacted by the dismantling of USAID.
Estimates from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation show as spending on Ebola-related aid, research, and operational support, including government funding delivered directly or through international aid organizations, fell to roughly $186,000 last year. That is down from about $23 million in 2021. Jeremy Konyndyk managed the U.S. response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014. He headed up USAID's response to COVID-19. Today, he is the president of Refugees International, and he joins us now here on this Saturday morning. Jeremy, great to have you with us. And I want to start first with just what you've observed here over the last few weeks. Christina mentioned just a moment ago, there is concern that the facts that we have, the data that we have, aren't painting a complete holistic picture of how wide this outbreak is. Your sense from your experience of how accurate that count seems to be?
Well, it's certainly an undercount. The case numbers when they announced the outbreak just over a week ago were just under 250. Now that's pushing 800 in the official count. But for cases to go up that quickly, that's not new transmission. That's just beginning to get a sense of how much is already out there. And I don't think we fully have that sense yet. There's not a full contact tracing and case finding operation underway yet. And so there is still a lot out there that we're not seeing. I'm sure it's over 1,000 cases by now. It could be multiples of that. This is already on paper the third largest outbreak in history. It's well on its way probably to becoming the second largest given the trajectory that it's on. And I think it's going to be exceptionally difficult to contain.
I know when you're trying to fight an outbreak, you're fighting not just a disease, but you're also fighting misinformation and disinformation. And talk to us a little bit about how hard that battle is as well, because I was reading about this crowd that set fire to one of the few functioning hospitals that treats Ebola specifically in the eastern DRC, and partially that was because there was mishandling. They didn't understand why they couldn't have the body back. There's an issue with burial customs where they're washing the bodies and then that water is being passed around and it's easy transmission. How do you fight this on two fronts, especially when you're short-staffed?
It's such an important point, and it's easy to get caught in this idea that we just need a health response, we just need clinics. Secretary Rubio has talked about setting up 50 health clinics, and like the health clinic piece of this is important. It's also really difficult to scale. And of course, you need, for those clinics to mean anything, people need to have confidence that they can use them. They have to have confidence and trust that they will get treatment that the treatment that they need, and that they understand that that's what they need to do. And that all really comes down to trust. And so an outbreak response, the foundation of an effective outbreak response is trust between the communities who are at risk and the health responses, or the operational and health response itself. And we saw this the last time there was a major outbreak of Ebola in Eastern Congo. That was in 2018-19. That was the second largest in history after the West Africa one that I worked on in 2014. And we saw these kinds of patterns. It's not surprising to me that people our community members are behaving this way, because they haven't, they don't understand the disease. They're not necessarily familiar with it. They don't necessarily believe everything they're being told. There's a lot of skepticism. This is a part of the country that has been affected by war for decades, that is often quite hostile towards the central government. And so when they have the Ministry of Health from the central government telling them something, they won't necessarily take that at face value. So that's going to be a huge hill to climb.
Jeremy, I want to ask you about the role that the U.S. is playing or isn't playing at this point in time. So we've seen the U.S., as Christina mentioned, withdraw from the WHO, not playing an active role in that organization any longer. I mentioned in the last hour, we were talking to our colleague Jason Gale, who covers public health, that we've both been kind of inundated with emails from the State Department over the course of this last week detailing what the U.S. has done here, noting that the CDC is running point here, and saying that the overarching objective here is to keep Ebola from coming into the United States. How different is the response posture from the U.S. this time around than what you lived through in 2014? Jason Gale mentioning to us that Tom Frieden, who ran the CDC, said that the Ebola outbreak was a full-time job back when he was in that position. And here we're in a position where a lot of these marquee positions in the public health apparatus in the U.S. are unfilled or filled by interim appointments.
Yeah, and Dr. Frieden and I worked very closely together on that response. We actually early in the U.S. response traveled out there together to Liberia to assess firsthand and to meet with the president of the country. There is just dramatically less capacity in the U.S. government to tackle a challenge like this than there was even 2 years ago. We had learned a lot of lessons from that 2014 Ebola outbreak. At that time, of course, USAID existed. There was a very robust CDC. We were a member of the World Health Organization. And all of those things were really important. USAID, CDC, and WHO worked together hand in glove to lead the international response to that outbreak, and then reprise that again in the large outbreak in the same area of Eastern Congo, or in 2018-19. And that's mostly gone now, that partnership. CDC is a shell of what it was, particularly their global capabilities have really been degraded. They're still there. I mean, look, the people are excellent. The people have tremendous knowledge, but will they be listened to by the people running U.S. health institutions right now? That's a big question. USAID, of course, is completely gone, and the U.S. is no longer a member of WHO, and often CDC staff are barred from even speaking to WHO. So that partnership has been just demolished.
I want to read some statements, as David mentioned, we've been getting from the State Department, saying it's false to claim that USAID reform has negatively impacted our ability to respond to Ebola. In fact, by bringing USAID global health functions under a new bureau at the State Department, our efforts are more aligned and effective. You also mentioned on Tuesday, the State Department announced they'd be funding these 50 clinics to aid in the DRC. But the top civil servant in Uganda's Ministry of Health said in an interview that the government was not aware of the pledge, and it wasn't immediately clear where those $13 million were part of, where that pledge was going, or where those clinics were being set up. Where is the breakdown there? Is this something that would usually happen through WHO, these organizations? What is the line of communication? And is this something you can just stand up, or does this need logistics and things on the ground that, as we've talked about, don't really exist?
Yeah, I really am disheartened by that whole exchange, because you see a few things there. First, so it was my job in 2014 to oversee the planning and development and funding of about 30 Ebola treatment units that we stood up across West Africa in that outbreak. Those things were wildly expensive. It cost us hundreds of millions of dollars to stand up and operate those things. So $13 million is barely a start to what it's going to cost to get this under control. But I think, they're hugely complex. It took us months to stand those up, because Ebola clinics are highly specialized facilities, because they are built around very high-end infection prevention and control, because you don't want to enable more transmission. It's the whole point of those facilities. They're very different from a normal health clinic and very difficult to set up. But really importantly, we did all that in close partnership with the ministries of health in the countries we were working with. And the last thing we would have ever wanted to do is catch them off guard with an announcement we hadn't discussed with them first and didn't have their buy-in on. So to see that sort of an exchange between the U.S. Secretary of State and one of the affected governments just, I think, speaks to the lack of coordination, the lack of engagement between the U.S. and those governments. And again, that's the sort of function that USAID would have facilitated, because there were deep webs of relationships between the USAID health personnel in those countries and their counterparts in ministries of health. And of course, that's all gone now.
Jeremy, let me ask you, as we wrap up here, how worried you are just about the circumstances that we're seeing in Africa right now. This is a different strain than we've seen before. There isn't a treatment for it. As you said, the numbers seem to be undercounts of what's likely the case there in the DRC. How concerned are you about the state of things now and where they're likely to go? And can you say unequivocally that without having USAID, without having the public health apparatus in place that we've had in the past, that's likely to make this outbreak much worse?
It's going to make the response much harder. And when you have a slower and less effective response, of course, the outbreak lasts for longer and it spreads further. And ultimately, a delayed or underpowered response just makes the ultimate job of containment harder, more expensive, more difficult. It will take longer. I fear that's what we're going to see. We're going into this with four strikes against us. This outbreak has the most momentum upon discovery of any Ebola outbreak in history. It's in Eastern Congo, which is a conflict zone with 3.5 million displaced people. And we know from the 2018-19 outbreak, it's very, very hard to fight Ebola under those conditions. That one took 2 years to get under control. There are no countermeasures and no vaccine for this, unlike the normal Ebola, not normal, but the other kind of main Ebola strain that we've seen, which is the Zaire version. And of course, we're doing this without U.S. aid, without the U.S. being part of WHO, and with a weakened CDC. So all of those things are going to make this job much harder.
Jeremy, I hope you'll come back and we can keep in touch throughout all of this. Jeremy Konyndyk, who's the president of Refugees International with a host of experience in public health for the U.S. government. Thank you very much for your time on this Saturday.
In Washington, there's a new head of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, taking the oath Friday morning at the White House from Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Warsh, who was once a federal governor, is now the Fed's 17th chair.
President Trump has long called for the Fed to lower interest rates, but inflation is still higher than the Fed's 2% target. After Kevin Warsh was sworn in, we spoke with Kate Davidson, Bloomberg's managing editor of U.S. economic policy.
The ceremony itself was unusual, and the Fed chair is usually sworn in a kind of a pro forma way at the Fed building. Kevin Warsh didn't have a chance to have the sort of ceremonial announcement of his nomination at the White House when he was first nominated by the president. So this was sort of a stand-in for that. The last time a Fed chair was sworn in at the White House was Alan Greenspan, so quite some time ago. But listening to what was said, I think it was interesting that the president kind of came out right away to say he expects that Kevin Warsh will be totally independent. He should do his own thing. Clearly seemed designed to maybe tamp down some of the concern among investors, a lot of the chatter around whether Warsh can actually do this. And the president up to now has made no secret of the fact that he wants interest rates to be lower. But he came out today and delivered a message that seemed to be, you know, Kevin, you have at least my support for now to do what you think is the right thing for the economy.
That does make me feel a bit better because we both covered Washington for a long time. I didn't remember this being a thing. No. So it hasn't been a thing in a while, these swearing in ceremonies for the Fed chair. But to the point, and to your point of all the people that were in the room, Treasury Secretary Bessent was asked if Warsh is going to cut rates. And he said, it was off camera, but he said he would, quote, do the right thing. But what is the right thing, and according to whom?
Right. Well, those remarks from Bessent, and we've heard similar comments recently from other allies of the president, seem designed to give Warsh some cover, right? That almost a way to explain maybe to the president that he's going to have a tough time coming in and cutting rates right away. Just based on what we're hearing from other Fed officials, they don't seem inclined to move at all, and he needs the support of those other officials. He can't just flip the rate switch. He can't do this on his own. It's a committee decision. Also, it was just what we make of how Kevin Warsh himself is going to essentially handle that decision. I mean, the president then followed up remarks on independence with, you know, what's good for the economy, Kevin knows, is when the economy is booming. So just let it boom. I mean, he could say, yeah, it should be an independent decision. But the president seems to be suggesting that letting the economy run hot is the right thing.
So this is where things get tricky. And I'd love for you to talk a bit about that. You have the president applying all of this pressure to cut rates, and yet it seems like the winds are blowing in another direction entirely. Let me play a little bit of sound here from Chris Waller, Federal Reserve Governor, talking about how he sees the Fed's job playing out here in the months ahead.
I can no longer rule out rate hikes further down the road if inflation does not abate soon. And that is especially true if measures of inflation expectations, some of which have risen lately, show signs of becoming unanchored.
Kate, explain what Chris Waller is saying there. He said rate hikes. He didn't say rate cuts. And I wonder sort of how emblematic that is of how a lot of policymakers in the Federal Open Market Committee feel about the direction the economy is headed in.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the conversation has shifted from can Kevin Warsh rally support for a rate cut to can Kevin Warsh hold off what seems to be building momentum for at least considering talking about a rate hike. So Fed officials talk a lot about inflation expectations. That's what they're really concerned about. They understand that right now, given what's happening with Iran, energy prices spiking, that's going to feed through to inflation right now. But what they would be more worried about is if you start to see consumers expecting that inflation is going to remain high for years into the future. And we actually got some new survey data suggesting that that is starting to become a bigger concern. That number, that long-term inflation expectation number, jumped quite a bit. I'm sure we'll be hearing more Fed officials talking about that. So it just feels like there isn't really a strong case right now to think about cutting rates. And the case is shifting a little bit toward, when will they have to start thinking about raising rates?
With rates aside, what else does Warsh want to do while he's at the Fed? He said he's reform-oriented. What does that mean? What changes do we think he's going to be implementing? What are the big takeaways that you expect to see him try to get through?
Well, I think that the things that we're expecting or bracing for, if you will, immediately are really around communications and how the Fed is going to be talking about and communicating its future moves. Kevin Warsh has made very clear that he doesn't think very much of this idea of forward guidance, that maybe that Fed officials talk too much, that they're giving too much information about what might happen in the future, and that's perhaps unwise in his view because things could change. So one of the questions we have is, will he continue the practice that Jay Powell established of having a press conference after every Fed decision? Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, Powell's predecessors, they had quarterly press conferences, so he could choose to dial those back. He could also choose to make changes to the Fed's summary of economic projections. Those are quarterly projections that each member submits a forecast for where they see the economy headed and interest rates. Those forecasts are anonymous, but again, Warsh has talked about those perhaps not being very useful because they give the investors and the public focus maybe too much, journalists maybe focus too much on that. So could he choose to get rid of that? Those are the kinds of things that we think he's thinking about. He's also talked a lot about the Fed balance sheet perhaps needing to be smaller. Not clear how quickly he can affect that change. And it's not clear how much of this exactly he can do. Some of it he could do on his own. Some of it he would need broader support. So I think some things, few things perhaps in the near term that we're looking at, but probably some of these bigger changes would be a longer term effort.
You've taken us right where I want to go, and that is, what do these next few months look like for him? He has this ambitious agenda. The economy's doing what the economy's doing. That's going to prove difficult, I imagine, for him and the policymakers there. What does he do in the months ahead? Is the main objective here to sort of introduce himself to the committee, make his opinions known, try to develop some form of respect or collegiality among them? What do the first few months of a new Fed chair's tenure look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think for him, perhaps that's something that he would be wise to come in and try and do. He has spent a lot of the last number of years really openly criticizing the Fed and its moves. And I think that there maybe are some, some hard feelings internally that he'll have to come in and try and smooth over. He clearly has to establish some credibility with the other 18 members of the Federal Open Market Committee that he needs to work with and to try to build some consensus with them. So there's so much uncertainty around the economic outlook. Of course, we'd normally expect to hear, hopefully pretty soon, from him on what his views are on interest rates and the outlook, because he hasn't really shared that. He wasn't really asked directly at his confirmation hearing, what do you think should happen with interest rates? And he certainly didn't address it at the swearing-in ceremony. So what does he think? Will we hear from him? I saw an analyst speculating today, maybe he just waits until his big Jackson Hole speech in August. That feels like a million years away, but there will be obviously a couple of Fed meetings and press conferences, again, presumably press conferences where he will speak. But I think everyone is anxious to know when is he going to deliver his first public remarks.
Our thanks to Kate Davidson. Well, President Trump touting the new Fed chair on the campaign trail last night while addressing pocketbook issues. He's also bragging about the primary candidates he has backed so far. They have won big in recent primaries in Indiana, Louisiana, and Kentucky.
I had a good night the other night, right? We knocked out a bad senator from Louisiana. We knocked out Massey, a horrible, one of the worst Republican congressmen ever. We knocked out somebody in Georgia, Rathensberger. We knocked him out. We knocked out everybody. We were 38-0. 30. Think of that, 38-0. Who's 38-0? We haven't lost one in years. You want to know the truth?
An enthusiastic President Trump there. All right, the president, as you see, is confident his endorsements will be just as effective in the general election. But our colleague Nancy Cook has been looking into recent polling data, and she's concluded that, quote, outside the MAGA bubble, Republicans are increasingly on the defensive. She goes on to write, gasoline prices keep inching higher, bleeding into the broader economy as the stalemate drags on. Long-term borrowing costs are on a tear, prompting fears the Federal Reserve won't cut rates again this year and may have to raise them. All right, Nancy is our senior national political correspondent for Bloomberg, and she joins us now. Nancy, all right, so we have this northern Kentucky race that you heard the president just reference. Thomas Massie, who's one of the president's bigger critics, especially when it came to the Epstein issue, lost by 10 percentage points. What do we learn from that race about how powerful the president is, especially in primaries?
Well, I think the president in primaries is still hugely influential with, the small core of the Republican base. I went to Kentucky, and I feel like people, when I was there 2 weeks ago, were very torn about supporting Massey or this Trump-backed candidate. But we saw the Trump-backed candidate prevail. And part of that was really from Trump's endorsement. But part of that was also the huge amount of outside money that flowed into the state. This was the most expensive House primary ever. And there were just a huge amount of mailers and door knockers. And what was interesting to me on the ground was just that the Trump-backed candidate, Ed Galrin, really his chief message to voters was, I will do whatever Trump wants. I will be a team player. And I think that he really prevailed, particularly with older voters. But I think the Republicans face a much trickier picture just heading into the November midterm elections.
Nancy, I want to ask sort of where this leaves Congress. If you're going to lose somebody like Thomas Massey, who, yes, has been a critic, as Christina pointed out, of the president and a lot of his policies, he's also been somewhat iconoclastic and has been, I think, kind of like upended the apple cart a little bit here, put sand in the gears, you pick your metaphor. What does this mean for the way that Congress operates, not having a voice like that in Congress, in all likelihood, assuming that the Republicans are going to win this seat in Kentucky?
Well, I just think that it means that Congress, it just makes Congress less of a check on the president. Thomas Massey, the interesting thing is he's so conservative. He really is. When I was down in Kentucky, he has like a very high rating among all these different conservative groups. And so it was interesting to me that he was so heavily targeted by the president because, for a lot of voters in Northern Kentucky, he checks the conservative boxes. He's a huge supporter of the Second Amendment. He is anti-abortion. He talks about, he's part of a community where Christian faith is very important. And so it's just interesting that, really the chief problem was that he defied the president. And that's why Trump went after him. And I think that not having him there just means there's fewer checks in the White House. I also think with Trump going after all these different Republicans, you've created a larger group of Thomas Massey-like figures who will be willing to defy the president. We already saw that this week with Senator Cassidy raising questions about that extra funding for the ballroom, or this DOJ weaponization fund. People who Trump unseats in primaries are not just going to blindly go along with the White House's agenda for the rest of the year. And I think that's going to become a problem for the White House.
So you just set up my next question that I really wanted to ask you, is exactly that, because these folks have lost their primaries. They won't be there in January, but they will be there until January. And Republicans have such a razor-thin majority in both houses, but especially the Senate. You mentioned Cassidy, Massey, Cornyn may not, win. He may lose to Ken Paxton. That's enough of a quorum in a lot of places to stop the president's agenda. And these folks may feel emboldened because they've got nothing else to lose.
Leslie Shedd called this the YOLO caucus.
As a former Republican strategist, current Republican strategist, former staffer, you're right. She said it's going to be the YOLO caucus. What do you think?
It is. And we've seen that with Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis decided not to run, Senator Tom Tillis, because he was going to face a tough primary. And he has been, almost like the Thomas Massey of the Senate. He held up Kevin Warsh's nomination to the Fed because he didn't like the investigation that DOJ was, launching at the Fed. So you've basically created just more people like Thomas Massey and Tom Tillis who are willing to critique the president and willing to say, this is unacceptable, or this part of the president flexing his power is just going too far. And I would say the White House and Capitol Hill already had a pretty tenuous relationship. There's a lot of people on Capitol Hill, lawmakers and staff, who feel like the White House is, someone described it to me, all sticks, no carrots, really just trying to dictate policy to them rather than sort of more of a collaborative relationship. And I think that we're going to see that stop. I think that the YOLO caucus, if we want to call it that, will be much more willing to raise questions about what Trump wants to do.
We're trying to make it a thing here.
Leslie should trademark that quickly, yeah.
Let's turn our attention to Texas. Christina bringing that up just a moment ago, this primary between Ken Paxton and John Cornyn, the sitting senator. You talked about the amount of money that's been poured into that race in Kentucky. Maybe not a commensurate amount of money. A lot of money being poured into this race in Texas as well. Is there a chance that this could backfire? The president did wait an awful long time to make his endorsement in this race. What does that tell you about, again, the kind of the momentum, the power that he has in this particular primary in Texas, Nancy?
Well, I think that the president waited a long time to endorse, and there were people on both sides making the argument that he shouldn't endorse or hold off. I do think that him endorsing Ken Paxton is quite a big deal, and I think that even the John Cornyn people think that. I really think that the president putting his thumb on the scale for Paxton is quite a big deal. And, I'm expecting, who knows, right? We have no idea what will actually happen. But I think that the expectation is that Paxton will likely win on Tuesday. And what that does is it basically creates a hugely expensive Senate race for the Republicans. Texas is a red state. It has not elected a Democrat to the Senate in decades. And what Trump has done by putting Paxton forward, who is an imperfect candidate, who's had a lot of ethical and personal scandals, is it means that Republicans are going to have to spend millions of dollars. We're talking about $200 million potentially to defend that seat against a Democrat. Whereas I think if he had endorsed Cornyn would have been likely to win. It just would have been, a much easier fight for the Republicans and a much easier time holding on to that seat.
Yeah, known quantity, less controversial, just kind of check the box and move on kind of candidate. I do want to ask you about the general election because, look, in a primary, you always run to the sides of the party and then try to come back in the middle. But it seems like this is an extreme case. And there's this new Quinnipiac poll released on Wednesday that kind of outlines the issue. You write it showed just 33% of voters approve of Trump's handling of the economy. That's the lowest in both his terms, while 64% disapprove. And most importantly, for Republicans, 70% of independent voters say they disapprove of the president's economic stewardship. We talked over and over again about how kitchen table issues are going to dominate this primary in November. Is it going to be hard for these candidates to run back to the middle or even towards the middle after getting these endorsements and winning these primaries?
I think it's going to be hugely difficult. And the thing is, for Republicans to win in the midterms in November, they need voters to support them beyond this MAGA base. They need some independents. They need some women. Trump won because he put together this very unique coalition of this Republican MAGA voters and also, health conscious voters who were interested in MAHA and Black men and young men and Hispanics. That coalition has broken apart and frayed now because people are unhappy with the economy. And Trump is just left with this little MAGA base. And, he's really underwater. Republicans are really underwater with independents in all of these different polls, the Quinnipiac poll, a new New York Times Siena poll. Independents do not like what he is doing on cost of living, on the war, on gas prices. This is going to be a huge problem for Republicans heading into November. And I think it's just, Trump is really celebrating now, but I think it's somewhat short-sighted because Republicans are going to have to appeal to a much broader group in the next 5 months.
Nancy, always great to talk to you. Thank you for getting up with us here on a Saturday morning. Nancy Cook, our national senior political correspondent, joining us from Washington, D.C.
I'm going to be really fascinated to see what happens with all these lame duck Republicans.
Yeah.
That if you start to see not only them pushing back, but, what we're always hearing off the record and behind doors is Republicans are not always happy with the president's policies. They just feel like they don't have an option. And it'll be interesting to see if this builds momentum and coalesces along some of these issues that are not popular, right? The slush fund, the ballroom, the Iran war.
Yeah, circumstances are different. Tom Tillis stepping aside, leaving his seat in Congress, but kind of filling that role as somebody who's in this new capacity willing to push back against the president. We'll see if these others follow suit. Let's get a check of the headlines now on this Saturday from Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
Yeah, and let's start with that gas explosion at a coal mine in China's northern province of Shanxi. It has killed at least 90 people. State media say the accident happened Friday evening. Nearly 250 workers were on duty at the time. Many were hurt by toxic gas. The cause of that explosion is under investigation. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for an all-out effort to rescue those that are still missing. Some 40,000 people were under evacuation orders in Southern California after a chemical tank leak. Now, that tank, it's located in an aerospace plastics facility in Garden Grove, and it holds between 6,000 and 7,000 gallons of a hazardous chemical. No injuries or deaths have been reported. In New York, one person, though, has died after a fire and 2 explosions on a barge at a commercial shipyard on Staten Island. More than 35 people were injured, most of them firefighters and other first responders. An investigation is underway. In other news, Tulsi Gabbard is resigning as Director of National Intelligence as her husband battles cancer. Gabbard was an outspoken critic for foreign intervention. She's also largely been sidelined from President Donald Trump's national security team. Her last day will be June 30th. And President Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., is having a wedding celebration this week weekend. It's reportedly being held on a private island in the Bahamas. President Trump said he will not attend the festivities because he has to focus on the war in Iran and other issues. But according to a marriage certificate obtained by TMZ, Trump Jr. and Bettina Anderson, they were officially married on Thursday in West Palm Beach, Florida. So maybe he did get to see some of the festivities. I don't know.
He wasn't there, was he?
Christina.
I can't remember if he was there on Thursday.
It's all a blur, but
He is a man the president has known for a long time, I believe, to paraphrase the president of the United States.
I'm not touching that, Lisa.
I'm not going to touch that.
Thank you very much. All right. I was not in on Wednesday, and I'm sad because you got to talk to Brendan Greeley about his new book, The Almighty Dollar. That's coming up.
It is coming up.
What is this about? What did you guys talk about?
Brendan Greeley, a former colleague here, he was a co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance, went on to spend some time at the FT before going to Princeton, where he's getting a PhD in the history of money, which is such a fascinating field. He has written this book, The Almighty Dollar, 500 Years of the World's Most Powerful Money. Talked about that, but talked about the role of the dollar in the U.S. and around the world today. We're going to get into that just after this break. Stay with us on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. SpaceX's Starship, well, it blasted off from the southern tip of Texas. Now, despite some engine trouble, it reached its final destination, splashing down in the Indian Ocean. It comes 2 days after CEO Elon Musk said he's taking the company public. In sports, the PGA tournament, well, it hits TPC Craig Ranch in McKinney, Texas. Siwoo Kim, he tops the leaderboard at 18 under par, followed by a 5-way tie for second. And that includes Americans Scotty Scheffler, Wyndham Clark, and also Jackson Stuber at 13 under par. Some NHL playoffs action last night. We had the Vegas Golden Knights. Well, they topped the Colorado Avalanche 3-1, Game 2. Tonight, the Montreal Canadiens, they take on the Carolina Hurricanes. And basketball, the Oklahoma City Thunder, well, they beat the San Antonio Spurs 123-108 in Game 3 of the Western Conference Finals last night. The Thunder, they lead the series 2-1. Tonight, the New York Knicks, they take on the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Knicks lead that series 2-0. And racing fans looking for some speed action ahead of the Indianapolis 500 tomorrow. They got a treat yesterday, kind of maybe not as fast. It was the 6 Oscar Mayer Wienermobiles. They competed at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for the second annual Weenie 500 race. Taking home the top trophy was a New York dog Wienermobile. Who knew? I'm not sure how fast they go, but if you want a fun fact, guys, the first Wienermobile created in 1936.
Lisa, are you trying to get me fired? What are you doing here?
I didn't know there were multiple Wienermobiles.
I did not know there were 6.
There are 6.
I thought it was always just a great stroke of luck if you were on the highway and saw one, that there only was one.
Let the mystery remain. Just let the magic remain. There's only one, David. If you find it,
it's an incredible race.
All right.
Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa, for that and everything.
All right. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency for decades, but its history goes back centuries to before the United States was the United States. In a new book called The Almighty Dollar, 500 Years of the World's Most Powerful Money, Brendan Greeley chronicles the currency's history, explains its dominance in global finance, and looks ahead to the role it will play in a world in which cash may no longer be king.
Well, this week I sat down with Brendan and I started off by admitting my surprise that the dollar does in fact predate the U.S.
And when I started working on this book, I was going to start it in 1971 when Nixon, took the dollar off gold. And then, I ended up in 1776. And there's a challenge at 1776 with the dollar, which is that, we're taught to assume monetary sovereignty. We assume that a country has control over its money. And if that's true, then you get new country, new money. We declared political sovereignty in 1776, but we did not declare monetary sovereignty. We decided that our currency was going to be a big silver coin from the Spanish Empire with a German name. And so that makes this question of new country, new money a little bit problematic. And sort of trying to figure that one out, I found this whole other story that starts in a silver mine in Bohemia in 1520. And we can talk about silver mines. I can talk to you for a very long time about silver mines. But I think more importantly, we have to recognize that the United States did not create the dollar. Monetary sovereignty is won very slowly and with a lot of difficulty over time, and it's constantly being eroded at the edges. And so the story for me of the dollar and America is two separate things. There's an American story, there is a dollar story. America won control over the dollar and may be in danger of losing it now. The history of a currency is not the history of a country.
Let's talk about the uniqueness of the dollar. And you quote Robert Mundell, the economist, who says, effectively all money sort of start domestic and some become international, they become global currencies. The dollar, as you point out, kind of subverts that paradigm. This is a global currency first.
See, this is what I love about David Gura. You read the book.
I read the book, yeah.
Aw. This is, it's very hard to think of a currency as inherently global because our experience with currency is local. And then if we go abroad, maybe somebody else uses it. Robert Mundell, so I'm going to take a huge risk here. I, in the book, disagree with a Nobel Prize winning. Yes, exactly. Robert Mundell has a Nobel. I do not. But he wrote that great currencies are the children of great empires. The problem with that is I don't see that with the dollar. So the original silver Joachimsthaler, so the word dollar comes from a valley in Bohemia that was settled by Saxon miners that produced silver. They made these big, very high quality silver coins that were not useful for sort of daily purchases, but were very useful for merchants in the Baltic. So those Joachimsthaler became known as taler, and then that's how we get the dollar in English. This system was already in place by Shakespeare, who mentions the dollar twice, once in the Scottish play, once in The Tempest. Okay. There was no empire pushing those coins out into the Baltic. There was no empire pushing those coins, through the Low Countries into England, where a groundling at the Globe Theatre would have known that a dollar was a big silver coin. Instead, they traveled because they were useful. Big coins worth about a week's labor, or I calculated 21 pounds of bacon at the time, and not really useful for daily purchases. They have a power on their own, and they were copied all over. So as soon as you get those taller, very quickly, within about 2 or 3 years, you start to get copies in northern German cities, copies in the Netherlands. And so this idea of a coin was inherently international from the start. And the Holy Roman Empire, neither Holy nor Roman nor an empire, but the Holy Roman Empire, which was sort of nominally in charge of that area at the time, for a lot of legal reasons, didn't like those silver dollars at all and resisted them as long as it could. Empire was actively fighting against this. But a certain kind of currency can be so useful to merchants and investors now and the wealthy that it has its own power and drags itself out of the world. It's not pushed by the empire.
And we hear over and over again that the dollar's supremacy is at risk at this political moment.
In any historical market that you look at, there were virtual promises and paper promises and silver and gold working together. Again, if we take the example of colonial America, a lot of commerce took place on the ledgers of shops. You would owe the shop money, and then you would come back and you would clear it, sometimes with money owed to another shop. Right? A lot of this money, they were aware, and they used these words in colonial America, of real and imaginary money. That's not a value judgment. Imaginary money isn't bad. It just means it's credit held on the ledger of a shopkeeper, right? And that was every bit as useful to them as the very real money that they had in gold, and then sometimes in bills of credit issued by the colonial governments. Okay, so we have always had virtual money. You know, almost all of our money has been held on the balance sheet of a bank. This was true in the 19th century. This is true in the 20th century. So the fact that we're moving beyond this physical note is interesting, but I don't think it represents a fundamental change in what money is. When we look at the dollar system, I think it's important to point out that it's composed primarily internationally of deposits on offshore banks. The way we create dollars now, brand new dollars, is commercial banks, when they lend you money through a mortgage or credit card loan, they just mark up your account with brand new dollars. They don't get those dollars from the Fed. Nobody arrives with like a case of $100 bills to hand them to the bank to hand to you. This is it's accounting that the bank does on its own ledger. So when we look at the future of the dollar system, we have to see what protects those dollars. The Federal Reserve has made clear that it will offer short-term loans to foreign central banks to bail these dollars out in a crisis. They've done it twice, 2009, again in 2020. American banking regulation is, you and I might have some issues with it, but it's pretty solid. We've had federal deposit insurance since the 1930s. No other country has this vast pool of insured deposits. Foreign investors come to rely on the reliability of domestic bank dollars in the United States. The third thing that holds the dollar up is the basic institutional strength of the United States. When we look at those three legs of the stool, the Fed, domestic regulation, and institutional strength, I don't think any of those is going away. None of those has disappeared. Offshore dollar deposits are still growing, but for the first time in our lifetimes, there's a question mark on each of them. There's a question mark on whether or not the Fed will, in fact, rescue foreign commercial banks and their dollars in a crisis this time around. There wasn't a question mark the last crisis. There's a question mark about American institutions. There are several question marks about American institutions. And there is a push within the Fed and within the federal government to loosen regulation on banks. We've already seen it with sort of the much lighter regulatory touch on stable coins, which are just a different form of dollar. So I don't think that stool is in danger of collapsing. But I do think that we're having this discussion, and that's slightly troubling that for the first time we're having this discussion. A year and a half ago, I don't think we'd be having this discussion.
Brennan, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Brennan Greeley there, author of that new book on the history of the dollar. Highly commended to you. You said read the
I'm
history
sold.
of the dictionary.
I did just read the history of the dictionary. This is right in my wheelhouse. I'm going to buy it. You should get it too. And there's a review of it up at our new books newsletter on Bloomberg.com. When we come back, BT dubs, some of the most read stories you may have missed this week.
And you can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more. Find it in one place. Check out Bloomberg.com/videos. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend, or BTW. For regular viewers of the program, I'm David Gura alongside Christina Ruffini. Lisa Mateo is here with some stories you may have missed over the course of this week. BTW, Bloomberg This Weekend, BTW, by the way.
There you go.
He broke it. Really want to underline that.
Way to say the full
really
W multiple times.
Yes.
Lisa, what BT dubs stories do you have for us today?
Ooh, do you guys like Diet Coke?
I
Are
do.
you a big fan?
I am a
you
fan of
are
Diet
a fan
Coke,
of
yes.
Diet Coke.
Yeah, I don't drink
Okay.
soda, but every once in a while I crack and let myself
and
have
that's
one.
that's your go-to.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one's from Reuters. Diet Coke parties.
Parties?
Yes. Iran war ends crisis fuels thirst for cola events in India. So here's the thing. Diet Coke, short supply in India. It's only sold in cans, so it makes it more susceptible to supply chain issues, and that's the reason. So Diet Coke parties are popping up. So what are these parties, right? So people pay about maybe $10 to $16 to get in, and then you go there, you enjoy your Diet Coke, but you can do other things too. They have activities. You can paint cans. You can make, Diet Coke shirts and just have a grand old time and enjoy the soda that they love that they can't get their hands on.
Very interesting. I usually am not in a party mood when I grab a Diet Coke. I just need a little jolt of caffeine and some refreshment. But I'm into this idea.
I'm into this. It would be fun. You wouldn't be hungover the next day. I think this is cool. Do they have like Diet Coke mixers?
They do. You
Just
can
a
mix them
lemon.
with
Just
like
put a lemon.
spices, jalapenos. You can put a little alcohol in there if you want. So
Ariana Grande or some pop star did something with jalapenos and Diet Coke. This is a thing.
Apparently
I can't remember who it was,
All right.
but
apparently it's good.
I'll give that a go.
All right. How
What else
about
you got?
wings?
Sorry,
Wings to go with that Diet Coke.
This
Okay.
is sounding like a good
Here it
Saturday.
is.
All right.
New York Times. Hooters says bring
Hooters.
the kids.
Lisa,
That
you
took
are
a turn.
killing me
That
today.
took a turn that I was not anticipating.
Lisa's on a timeout.
Okay, so it's known for being this place, right? Where guys
place.
go and
Yes, it's known
enjoys,
for being this place.
a place where they go enjoy a beer, right?
Sure.
But now what they want to do is bring more families in and get more families to go. Full disclosure, I have to admit, we had my son's 8th birthday. We go to Hooters. I know, Mother of the Year. But they're trying to change things. So the problem is that Hooters, remember, it's split into two. There was Hooters Inc. and then there's Hooters America. One went bankrupt. The other, who are the founders,
no knowledge of this.
they're trying to get, change the brand, and that's what they want to do. They want to make it more.
The brand seems pretty sad.
It does.
I must say.
In your defense, there used to be Hooters in the mall, and we would go in as kids with our mom to just go get some hot wings.
They
and
do
it was
have
very
good
chill,
wings.
and it was nice.
Thinking
It was
what? There was
They
like
do
a
have
bird
good wings.
exhibit or something you could go?
But
there are limited restaurants in some towns in the 90s,
All right.
and
Yeah.
it was cheap and it was good.
But you know what? They do have kids eat free on Saturdays. So
That I didn't know.
That's
Wow.
a big draw. That's a big draw in there, guys.
All right, one more. Sneak it in here.
Okay, this is the weekend. People are starting to look different, right? Because of GLPs, facelifts, things like that. So what happens when someone you love changes their face? So basically, it's just this fallout, like families who feel like the face kind of robbed them of their real mom or their real dad or things like that. So it's kind of a look into the books, the films, the TV shows that are centered around this because of all the changes that people are going through physically.
Check that out on the Bloomberg, Bloomberg.com. Lisa, appreciate as always that BTW. And I should note, this is a Memorial Day weekend when the weather is pretty crummy here in New York. Not ideal hiking weather. It is the season for outdoor activities, though.
It is, and this is where you start to come out and like try to hit a trail, or I usually have to dig the hiking shoes out of the back of the closet. But if you're looking for solitude on these trails, it's getting a little harder to come by.
Yeah, Bloomberg Ideas and Culture senior writer Felix Salmon loves a crowded trail, he tells us. He kicks off a new series on the show called In Defense Of.
Hiking in the wilderness, just you communing with nature, getting away from the crowds, discovering something about yourself and the way we all relate to Mother Earth. I love that. I love the solitude. But what I really love is hiking with crowds. Crowded hikes can be truly wonderful. The absolute highlight of 2025 for me was the 8 hours I spent hiking the Tongariro Crossing in New Zealand, the greatest day hike in the world. Were there crowds? Hell yes! I went midweek, off-season, and even then the trail was filled with hundreds of other hikers, including a boisterous group of school kids. The crossing is one of the most popular hikes on the planet. That is something that makes many outdoors types shudder. Who wants to go on a 13-mile hike where you're constantly close to other walkers? Well, me, for starters, and nearly all the other people on the trail with me. We're not snobs like the driver of the shuttle bus that took me to the trailhead. He compared the crossing to Queen Street, Auckland's main shopping street, but people like shopping too. My bus driver was a local, of course. Happy tourists often mean unhappy locals who don't much care for them, but the point is, those tourists are happy. About 50 miles north of Times Square, you'll find Breakneck Ridge, a super steep climb, easy to get to by train from Grand Central. When it reopens next year, it will see more than 200,000 visitors a year, and nearly all of those people will be very happy to be there. There's almost no evidence that greater numbers result in a measurably worse day out for hikers, and this hike, Breakneck Ridge, has become one of New York's shared experiences. I will admit there does come a point at which hiking trails just have too many people on them. Angel's Landing in Zion National Park is narrow and vertiginous, and out-of-shape tourists regularly stop to catch their breath or take photographs, and as a result, it's almost impossible for hikers to walk at their natural pace. But most hikes, including Tongariro and Breakneck, aren't like that. Sierra Club snobs will probably never believe it, but a lot of people are drawn to hikes not in spite of their popularity, but because of it. Tongariro has toilets. I do get the value of being alone in nature, but it can also be invigorating to enjoy something more communal and spectacular. And as someone who has now done the Tongariro crossing, I want as many other people to enjoy it as possible. Artificially limiting numbers would just be artificially limiting joy. See you there?
Coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, President Trump cancels travel as he weighs his next moves on Iran.
This is not good timing for me. I have a thing called Iran and other things.
Who he's meeting with as he tries to secure a deal.
And tracking an outbreak.
The outbreaks of Ebola and hantavirus in the past 2 weeks show why international threats need an international response.
The WHO says Ebola poses a very high risk in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as suspected cases triple in a week.
Plus, summer sticker shock.
We could see that $5 sign by July 4, and who knows? If Americans don't slow down at $5, we could see $6 by Labor Day.
How the Iran war is pushing prices at the pump to their highest levels in nearly 4 years. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We are here with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, May 23rd, and we've got a lot coming at you this 9 a.m. hour, so we're going to get straight to Lisa with the headlines.
You got it. In Persian Gulf nations, Pakistan, they are stepping up efforts to push for an Iran peace deal. Pakistan's army chief visited Tehran Friday for discussions on an accord with Iran's foreign minister. And sources tell Bloomberg the United Arab Emirates has joined Qatar and Saudi Arabia in appealing to President Donald Trump to allow more time for negotiations. Axios and CBS News reported that Trump was preparing for a possible fresh round of strikes. Now, meanwhile, Israel's military hit 2 residential buildings in post-warning strikes in central Gaza, leaving 2 people wounded and major damages. That's according to hospital officials and residents. There were no reported casualties. Yesterday, the president told a rally in New York the war will be over, quote, soon. He also talked about taxes in the state.
New York can never be the same if it's losing its tax base, and the people that pay 85% of the taxes are leaving. And we're taking in illegal immigrants. Oh, they're wonderful people and all, but they're not paying any tax. They're taking your money.
In other news, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in India for a multi-day visit. The State Department said Rubio's trip will focus on energy security, trade and defense cooperation. Rubio already met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi today, and the U.S. ambassador to India posting on social media that Rubio has extended an invite to Modi to visit the White House in the future. And the U.S. Department of Defense has released another round of what appears to be unclassified material of UFOs. The footage shows more black and white images of flying objects traveling at high speeds. The first round of clips, they were released earlier this month by the Trump administration to promote transparency. David and Christina, over to you.
Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, President Trump staying in Washington this weekend after scrapping a trip to Bedminster, New Jersey. According to the New York Times, he has been reviewing military options for potentially resuming the bombing campaign against Iran.
That's right. But according to the Qataris, the president also just had a phone call with the emir of that nation where they discussed de-escalation of tensions in the region as well as maritime safety in the Strait of Hormuz. Back with us is Bloomberg's White House correspondent Kate Sullivan. Kate, as we're hearing all these Gulf allies and some European allies as well are trying to dissuade Trump from restarting this conflict, when it comes to who's talking to him in the White House and who's helping him make these decisions, he's down one key player, and that's DNI Tulsi Gabbard, who resigned yesterday, citing health concerns with her husband. Talk to us a little bit about her role and then just the national security apparatus around the president and who is advising him as he goes into all these foreign policy issues.
Yeah, that's right. So it was surprising news yesterday. Tulsi Gabbard said that she had presented her letter of resignation to the president, that her husband is battling cancer and that she wanted to be by his side. I will say that Gabbard has been a really interesting figure in the administration, particularly amid the war. She's been very vocal about her anti-interventionist stance. She's been, when she was on the campaign trail with Trump, she was talking a lot about no new wars and no new foreign conflict. So she is on the record with essentially saying that she is not for starting new wars abroad, and she has not been a key figure in the room. We have reported this; others have reported this. In recent weeks, when it comes to Venezuela and Iran and some of the discussions about Cuba, she has been, of course, she had a top role in the administration, but the reporting says that she was not really a key figure in these discussions. Trump has a very small national security team around him. It's a very small group of individuals that includes Marco Rubio. J.D. Vance is also part of that. Pete Hegseth. There are other top advisors, but really when it comes to who he's listening to and talking about these things with, it's a smaller group than you'd expect.
Yes, I will note that in our reporting, an indication that some people refer to DNI as "do not invite." That was a nickname her position earned over the course of this second term. Kate, you mentioned Cuba, and I'd love to go there as well. Yes, there's a lot of talk about what might happen next with Iran, how long this ceasefire might last. Will it be continued, perhaps in perpetuity? At the same time, we have seen over the course of this last week a lot of pressure ratcheting up on Cuba as well. Talk a bit about that and what the latest thinking is among members of this administration and observers about where all of this might be headed.
It was interesting because we've heard Trump really escalating. Up until this week, we really heard him escalating his rhetoric on Cuba and saying a lot of things along the lines of, after Iran, we're going to turn to Cuba. I might be the first president to really do something there, really kind of heavily hinting at potential military action in Cuba. I thought it was interesting when he was speaking to reporters on Wednesday, I believe, he seemed to downplay the need for military action and to further ratchet up pressure on Cuba. And this is coming, of course, after the indictment of Raul Castro, the former president of Cuba, which in of itself was a huge escalation. You know, the United States has charged him with murder. And so but it was interesting after that, you know, which a lot of people saw as sort of perhaps a prelude to U.S. military action in Cuba. The president, at least publicly, is now saying that there is not a need to further ratchet up pressure there. And he was asked about military action in Cuba, and he seemed to really downplay the need for that. So it's unclear what the next steps are on Cuba, but of course we're closely watching any and all developments there.
Strategic ambiguity, Christina.
Yeah, that was surprising to me. Given the indictment and then the president's rearranged travel plans, we were bracing for another long night and a busy morning. But so far, the center seems to be holding. Before we let you go, I do want to ask you just briefly about Ebola, which is the other big story we've been talking about this morning. I actually just asked our control room because I didn't remember the president talking much about this. He was asked about it a couple days ago if he was concerned about Ebola and said, I'm concerned about everything, but certainly am. I think, you know, it's been confined right now to Africa, but it's something that had a breakout. And then he turned to other individuals to speak more about it. Has there been a lot of messaging from the White House on this? We've heard from the State Department, we've heard a bit from health apparatuses, CDC, about how they're trying to prevent the outbreak from coming here. But is this an issue that's even really on the president's radar at this point?
It's a great question. We've not heard a lot of messaging on Ebola specifically. The president has been asked about it a couple of times. And like you mentioned, he said, you know, sort of he'll make these statements like, well, you know, of course, I'm concerned about everything. And I think it's also important to note that, you know, health officials and experts are saying that these cuts to USAID and the United States pulling out of the WHO, that has really negatively impacted the response to Ebola on the ground. But so far, we've not heard a lot from this White House about what the plan is and how concerned they are. And so I think it'll be something that we just continue to watch in the coming weeks, but we've not heard a lot from the president on this so far.
All right.
Kate Sullivan, thank you very much. Appreciate you joining us here on this Saturday. And we're going to keep talking about foreign policy here as President Trump considers what's next with the war in Iran. Former U.S. officials like General David Petraeus, who served as the director of the CIA, and of course was the commander of CENTCOM, are meeting with world leaders to discuss all of the global conflicts we've been talking about over the course of the morning. He has been to Kyiv himself 10 times since Russia invaded Ukraine. And last week, he was in the Middle East. On the heels of that trip, I sat down with the general and I asked him how he defines victory in Iran. Thank you very much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, David.
How do you define victory in Iran now, a couple months into this conflict?
Well, I think actually getting an agreement that would restore freedom of navigation of the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz without Iran laying claim to it and being able to tax people going through it and ships. I think that's probably the most important goal at this moment. But of course, that doesn't address the other core issues that we have with Iran, such as its nuclear stockpile of almost 1,000 pounds of 60% enriched uranium. That's just one level below weapons grade. The right to enrich in the future, their support to proxies in the region that are pretty murderous, the Hamas, Hezbollah, Shia militia in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, and then the missile programs and the rest of this. And I think it's a pretty limited amount of these other concerns that may ever get addressed. But clearly, there has to be an agreement to get the strait reopened and to restore freedom of navigation without. There might be some arrangement where perhaps there is some modest fee charged that might go in part to Iran, Oman, who knows, and navigation aids or something like this. But that, I think, is the imperative at this moment in time. And I'm not sure that Iran is going to be willing to do that. Right now, they are insistent that they are given control of the Gulf, the Strait, and that they are able to charge tolls for it. That's just, I think, unacceptable. And it may be that we have to go back to war to show them that we're pretty serious about this.
You spent a lot of time in the region. You were in Iraq recently. What have you learned traveling through those countries in recent weeks about how they see this conflict unfolding?
Well, it varies. I mean, someone was asking me, what do the Gulf states think? Well, the Gulf states, no, it's not. It's not aggregate. You can't aggregate. You have to look at each one. The Emiratis are particularly outraged by, and they've been the biggest target of the drones and so forth by Iran, in part perhaps because they're supportive of the U.S. and have the Abraham Accords with Israel. Others have not been on the receiving end as much, but Qatar's lost 17% of their LNG production capacity for 3 to 5 years. The Saudis are actually trying to broker a bit. I actually met with the Crown Prince when I was there last week. They're working through the Pakistanis, with whom they have a very close relation. I think it was 8,000 Pakistani troops just deployed to Saudi Arabia to help with counter-drone and a variety of other security tasks. So it really does depend on the country and so forth. They all want, though, to see the Strait of Hormuz reopened and to ensure that there's not going to be a toll or a control by Iran exerted on that. That's the be-all and end-all for all of them. But in the wake of it, you're going to see enormous investment in hardening, resilience, redundancy, alternatives to the use of the strait, routes out for crude oil and natural gas other than a ship that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is very, very profound. This is a very big implication, especially if you're a partner in an investment firm like KKR.
So the investment becomes more inward, I imagine, for a lot of these nations.
Yeah.
In the past, they might have used their sovereign wealth funds to invest in U.S. companies. Tech
They've always done a lot inward, but I think there's going to be a period of time, a number of years, where the focus really is on what they need to do to reduce their vulnerability in the future, both to attack. So there's going to be a lot of implications for the military, organizational changes, what they buy, how they buy it, and all the rest of this, how they train and operate. There's very, very profound changes out there as a result of this, which we haven't really seen. I don't think it's been much more steady state in a variety of ways for a number of years.
Are these Gulf nations reevaluating their relationship with the U.S. in light of this? Have they felt unprotected or unbacked up?
I'm sure they have.
Yeah.
These states tried to stay out of this. They tried to take a knee. We were denied access to the base, many of the bases we normally occupy. Now, the truth is we're not as inclined to occupy these bases now that we have seen what the Iranians can throw at them. This is much more than when I was the commander of Central Command, for example, back from 2008 to 2010. Back then, my forward headquarters was at a huge air base outside Doha, Al Udeid. We had a beautiful headquarters paid for by the Qataris, $100 million or whatever, but half of it's above ground. And I can assure you, the Central Commander did not do what his predecessors have always done, which is be in the same time zone with all of your forces. He stayed at the base at MacDill Air Force Base outside Tampa. That's where the war has been run from, not from the forward headquarters. The Combined Air Operations Center, which functions at that same air base, runs the air war for the region. And in this case, even had the Israeli Air Force as part of it in many respects. They didn't run from out there either because it's vulnerable. They actually ran it from an air base in South Carolina.
How should this conflict reframe the way that we look at U.S. military readiness? So we see the use of drones in Iran. We've seen them, of course, in the Ukraine wars as well. I think there's been some fear that the U.S. has deployed a lot of military might in the Middle East that might leave it vulnerable were China to do something.
Well, there's
How
a
do you
number
think
of
about
issues.
that?
Well, I've said publicly for a number of years and written about it as well, and very recently in the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, The Hill, I was trying to get attention of Congress on an issue, that we have not remotely learned all the lessons we should have from the war in Ukraine. That is the future of war right now. It's a war in which one side alone, Ukraine, is using 10,000 drones a day. 90% of the casualties on the Russian side are caused by drones. Tanks can't maneuver anymore. They can't survive. Armored vehicles, you can't even drive vehicles in the death zone, which is 35 kilometers on either side of the front lines, which aren't even lines anymore because drones can fly into trenches and kill people. So they're survival positions. So this is just a vast change. And by the way, there's more coming because within a year or two, we're going to see not remotely piloted unmanned systems. And keeping in mind that Ukraine is going from 3.5 million drones manufactured last year to 7 million this year. So they can get up to 20,000 drones per day if they can find the pilots. But in the future, we're going to see autonomous systems, truly autonomous, that do not require a pilot to remotely operate them. And then you face drone swarms. And that is something for which we really don't have a solution. There's high-powered microwave coming. It's very short range. It's very effective. But you're going to have tons of it, given the 2 to 3 kilometer range that it has. It's spectacular. Everything drops, but you're going to have a lot of them. So that, I think, hopefully, this is going to drive home the absolute imperative of true institutional change in the United States, overhauling the entire concepts of war and operation, the attendant organizational changes, sweeping, unmanned systems force equal to the Army, Navy, Air Force in Ukraine, for example. Change how you train and operate, change how you educate your leaders, and change, obviously, what you buy and even how you buy it, because you want the opportunity to make software changes every week or two, hardware changes every few weeks. This is a very different model from what we have. Beyond that, we've obviously used a lot of our exquisite munitions, cruise missiles and so forth, and a lot of our exquisite missile interceptors, a very substantial number. And we have really got to get the arsenal of democracy going again. Right now, the arsenal of democracy is in Ukraine, not the United States. And we have got to make huge changes. And the president's doing that. He called together all the defense major companies and so forth, laid out what we need them to do in terms of tripling or quadrupling production of certain systems and so forth.
On Ukraine, does it feel like we are at a tipping point? We had the approval of this very sizable package from the Europeans. Yeah. We've seen drone attacks now closer to and on Moscow. Are we in a different place now than we were 6 months ago?
Yeah, we are. And I've actually said for almost a year now that I could envision a situation in which, if there's sufficient support for the Ukrainians, and this 90 billion euros from the European Commission is very, very helpful. It probably takes care of them for another year and a half. And if they can continue to increase the production of drones and pilots and units that can use them and all the rest of that, and start going deeper in Russia and inflicting such casualties on Russia that it's maybe the same as what they're recruiting on a monthly basis. They've now taken almost 1.4 million killed and wounded. That's more than we sustained in all of World War II. So, and all of a sudden, last month, the Ukrainians took back more territory than the Russians actually took from them. These are incremental gains, but more for the Ukrainian side, and Ukrainians causing staggering amounts of Russian casualties. I just don't think that Russia can continue this. Certainly next year at some point, I think Putin's going to look in the mirror, especially if the lifting of sanctions on their oil sales and the price of oil are reimposed. And his national welfare fund runs out of money because it's being diverted to the military-industrial complex. If all that happens, I think you could see a point where Russia needs a cessation of hostilities as much as does Ukraine.
Last question is just about the balance of hard power and soft power at this moment. So we've seen the U.S. take Nicolas Maduro, bring him to the United States, seen the U.S. deploy hard power in Iran as well. How good are we with that balance at this point? How important is it to have that equilibrium between the hard power that we're using and the soft power that we're deploying around
It's
the
a
world?
really interesting question, and I'd have to say that certainly from my time in uniform at the CIA, that the hard power is much more prominent and the soft power is much reduced. I mean, just the fact that we did away with the Agency for International Development, USAID, that we aren't funding anywhere near what we did, although Congress has actually restored a lot of this. But, we used to say that what solidifies the gains on the battlefield, if you can establish a security foundation, what solidifies it is the soft power. It's providing humanitarian assistance. It's restoring basic services. It's rebuilding damaged homes, schools, clinics, shops, roads, bridges, all of this, so that the people say, you know what? I don't want these guys to come back and jeopardize this. Let's get rid of al-Qaeda. What do they bring on us? Let's get rid of these insurgents. Let's marginalize the Shia militia supported by Iran, all this kind of stuff. So that's what soft power does. To be sure, there are many pet rocks in the numbers that, every congressman or executive branch official has. We can probably survive very well without all these well-meaning programs and so forth, but you can't survive when you're trying to turn security gains into actual solidified gains overall without that kind of soft power. So I'm a bit concerned by that.
General, thank you very much.
Great to be with you, David. Thank you.
Nice interview, David.
Thank you very much. A new Bloomberg report out just moments ago on the terminal at Bloomberg.com digs deeper into the president's latest financial disclosure, more than 3,700 trades that were made in the first quarter of this year.
That's right. That's an eye-popping number, and our intrepid reporting team looked into what those trades were, when they happened, and the strategies behind them. Elena Papina oversees our coverage of North American equities, and you and your colleagues wrote the piece. She joins us now on set. I want to start with the chart. Wait, we have charts.
It's a graphic-intensive piece.
The chart. I think we're going to have a chart on a wall here in a sec.
Okay, good.
But it says 59% of trades happened within one trading day of a major market event. Can you walk us through what that means?
Yeah, we looked at all of the trades, excluding obviously weekends, and we look at when they took place. And some of the biggest and busiest days were inflation days in January and in February. We looked at the day before, the day of the inflation report, and the day after. Now, this does not mean that the president had any inside information. It could have corresponded with some automatic trades, but that is interesting, and it shows that the president or his team pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the macro world and the macroeconomic data.
When you did this analysis, what stands out to you the most? Is it the quantity of trades that took place here? Is it what the president traded or what his account traded? What's most interesting to you as somebody who's kind of digging through all of this?
Yeah, it's interesting that the trades are very chaotic, which means that it's probably a compilation of several accounts, several investment accounts, not just one. Because I'll give an example. You saw the same stocks being bought and being sold on the very same day. Sometimes,
the same day.
Sometimes multiple times a day.
Interesting.
Wow. Which probably means that there were different entities taking care of the trades, executing the trades. And what it also means is it's probably a combination of a human making the trade and an automated trade. So, which leads us to believe that we just don't know if, these entities talk to each other or if it's just some kind of, a compilation of different trades in the market.
That's so interesting. So this story lit up like wildfire, especially over the Twitterverse, the Xverse, whatever we call it now. It was picked up a lot, I think just because some of those numbers are so huge. And we had one of your colleagues on last week when this first broke, and she was saying there was a lot of things they still didn't know, including some of the stuff you're talking about. So how did you find that out? Was it that more information was released, or you've had more time to go through it?
We had more time to go through the data and analyze the data, but we had a lot of information, but not enough to make any conclusions. But for example, the dollar range of the trades would go from $100,000 to $250,000. So we could talk about no trades, just a couple of hundreds of stocks, or we can talk about dozens of hundreds of stock trades. So we don't really just know that. What we do know is a lot of the trades, 2,000 of the 3,700 trades happened in March. And we know that that's when the war in Iran started. So some of the trades in March were done by human beings. We can see in the contours. We don't know that for sure, but we see the contours of that trade. We see discretionary positions. We see, some of the actions in the market. And we just looked at what was bought and what was sold and how the market performed on those days. So the trades in March had some contours of an actual human being doing that. Other than that, we don't really know. So it's some of those trades are tax harvest losses, when your portfolio underperforms and you just sell the stocks to pay fewer taxes. But some of that is just some automatic trades that just happen for no reason.
I want to get into this because you and your colleagues have such visibility into sort of how high net worth individuals approach their investments.
Yeah, these are not problems I have.
No,
but
right.
Yeah.
And this is a unique high net worth individual. But as you talk about the fact that there was clearly some, not clearly, but likely some human involvement here, some algorithmic involvement. You mentioned the tax harvesting efforts that were put in place. Well, how normal is that when you look at somebody who has these kinds of means? Is this an anomalous way of approaching one's portfolio, or is this the way that a lot of wealthy people would think about handling their investments?
This is an enormous way of approaching portfolio for someone like President Donald Trump.
Okay.
Arguably the person who is so widely followed on social media, who talks about the stock market all the time. So we know for sure that a lot of people are going to be laser focused on these trades, laser focused on analyzing the portfolios. But the dozens of experts we talked to said it's very very hard to make a conclusion that these trades were profitable. In fact, there are some signs that show that these trades were not profitable. Of course, it's impossible to just connect the dots for so many trades at the same time. But yeah, that's just quite a dilemma for sure.
That's so interesting. Yeah, we talked about that last week, especially if you're talking about it seems like one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and they're doing trades that are canceling each other out. And just folks we talked to said the sheer volume is a little bit, chasing your tail, and it doesn't really show a strategy. What would be your recommendation looking at these numbers? Like, calm down, like pick back a horse that you believe in. Too much trading.
Yeah, too much trading. I wouldn't advise anyone. I'm not in a position to make an investment advice. But
right.
yes, don't look at the trades and just follow the trades blindly. Just because of some of the trades were chaotic because there were several entities executing the trade. But also, on the grand scheme of things, this is the biggest filing we have ever seen from a sitting U.S. president. So it's just really important and really interesting, frankly, just to analyze that and see what potential strategies were implemented, how the trades were executed. I'm sure that's going to be an evolving story and evolving conversation.
You mentioned looking at this in complement with the way that other presidents have approached their investments. I'm curious, as you and your colleagues looked at President Trump's disclosure from the first quarter as compared to quarters before that, maybe during his first term, how much has his or his team's approach changed just himself? I mean, it seems like this is anomalous in the context of his trades overall.
Yeah, I mean, we never saw a filing that was this big. And he's not, just under any obligation to be this specific in the filing. So that was really interesting.
And can you explain what the threshold is for what you have to file or what the disclosure is?
Yeah, so, every significant trades you have to disclose, but you don't have to disclose the profit or loss. You don't have to disclose the sheer volume of trades. You can give us a ballpark of the dollar value of the trades. So that's what was given. For example, the ballpark would be $100,000 to $250,000. So go figure. Was it, somewhere in between? Was it on the lower end? Was it on the higher end? We just do not know. Yes, but some of the trades, there were 3,700. Some of them were municipal debt obligations. Some of them were corporate debt. So it was mostly about the stock market, but not just about the stock market.
A basic question here. Did it work? Is this working for President Trump? So when you look at all of this in aggregate, the volume of trades that you're talking about, the efforts to buy and sell sometimes multiple times in a day, is he beating benchmarks? Is this paying off for the president? Do we have any indication of that based on this financial disclosure?
We have no indication.
None.
There is no way of knowing that.
That's no fun.
Sure.
All right.
Yes. I know there is a lot of talk about that in the media. There is a lot of talk about that on Twitter. But we just don't know if he profited from the trade. And some of the contours of some of those trades show that he didn't.
You talk about the timing of this and how it was timed to some of the inflation announcements. Are there any other trades timed to any other events like the invasion of the war in Iran or what happened in Venezuela? Do you see any other timelines lining up with historical events or policy
Maybe even
making?
meetings with executives?
Exactly, policy out of the White House.
Yeah, I know it was interesting that he made a trade of Apple about a week before he talked to Tim Cook. Not talked, he praised CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, publicly. So again, we don't know how the trade panned out. We don't know when it was bought and when it was sold. All we see is just that happened. And then we cannot just make any definitive conclusions off of that. But just one point is a big part of those trades happened in March, happened at the beginning of March, when there was a lot of volatility around the price of crude oil, around the stock market, around the SIBO VIX index. So that actually tells us that his advisors, whoever executed the trades, are paying a lot of attention to the markets.
About a minute left. I wonder if you could kind of synthesize the blowback that this disclosure is getting. So we've heard from the likes of Senator Elizabeth Warren, other lawmakers saying, look, we long for a quainter time when presidents had their assets in a blind trust and really didn't touch them and didn't trade in stocks. How much of a groundswell is there kind of against the president looking at the trading strategy that we see here?
Yeah, we talked to a lot of strategists in the stock market who analyze high portfolios of high net worth individuals, who analyze tax loss strategies. And what they tell us is, that's a standard procedure for a lot of big funds. It's not, usually as big as the current one. But what is interesting is, it remains to be seen if the president is going to continue disclosing his filings at this amount. Because if that happens to be the case, then we're going to see the quarter-by-quarter comparison. 3,700 announcements in the first quarter, followed by the second quarter, followed by the third quarter, and then we can talk about making some definitive conclusions.
All right, Elena Papina, you oversee our coverage of North American equities, and I know you will continue to dig through this data. Thank you, and thank you to your whole team.
Yes. Let's go check the headlines now with Lisa Mateo, who's standing by with those. Lisa.
You got it. And let's start with the World Health Organization. They start having some information out right now. It's saying that the Ebola outbreak now poses a very high risk for Congo. Now, that's up from previous categorization of high, but it adds that the risk of disease spreading globally, that remains low. Yesterday, authorities in northeastern Congo, well, they banned funeral wakes and gatherings of more than 50 people to curb that outbreak. Foreigners seeking permanent residency in the U.S. will now have to leave the country to apply for green cards. The surprise change by the Trump administration to a long-standing policy is sparking concern for critics who say requiring people to travel abroad could leave many stranded for weeks, months, or even years in backlogged appointment systems. And in company news, Micron Technology's president and CEO says the memory chip shortage could last beyond this year.
Yes, there is a shortage, but Micron is working hard to increase supply through these projects here in America, here in Manassas, Virginia, Boise, and New York. And we see this shortage continuing beyond, well beyond 2026 timeframe.
Now, he says the demand has surged because of the importance of the capability of memory that's crucial for all advanced systems. Well, Uber and DoorDash may be battling it out in a bid for Germany's delivery hero. Now, the Financial Times is saying those two companies have held talks with investors, and sources say several investors have said they would seek a price of above $46 per share. David and Christina, we could have maybe another merger on our hands.
There we
We'll
go.
see.
It's a busy time for those. Lisa, thank you very much.
Certainly lots to talk about. All right, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer is resisting calls to resign for now after his Labour Party suffered heavy losses in recent local elections.
As we discussed last week, Britain has seen 6 prime ministers in the past 10 years. Bloomberg Originals explains how British politics is colliding with economic reality, fueling a revolving door of prime ministers.
Spare a thought for 19-year-old Larry.
Larry, the Downing Street cat, has outlasted David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and maybe now even Keir Starmer.
The knives are now well and truly out.
Dozens of MPs call for the UK Prime Minister to get ready to step down.
And this is what's got people asking, what on earth is going on in the UK?
If you speak to any of the last few prime ministers, they might tell you that Britain is ungovernable.
Well, except the current one.
No, I don't think Britain is ungovernable.
The rhetoric stems from a reality that over 7 years, Britain has churned through 5 prime ministers, while lack of growth and a cost of living crisis have stubbornly stayed put.
Voters and other politicians are so impatient to see change and improvement that the immediate thought goes to, well, let's change the Prime Minister.
And would-be successors are lining up again. But voters may be overlooking another permanent presence in British politics, less furry than Larry and much less forgiving.
You're seeing the bond vigilantes waving their pitchforks and coming out for blood.
Wow, gilts are really exciting.
Oh, they are. And here's the proof. Britain saw the yield on 30-year government bonds, known as gilts, hit new highs in May.
Although this is primarily a political battle, there's no getting away from the fact that the bond market looms large over the whole drama.
So this is a story of how Britain's political crisis collided with economic reality. What that means for Keir Starmer, the country, and Number 10's longest-serving resident.
Love that punctuation.
The cat at Number 10 Downing Street.
Very nice.
Flawless editing, flawless editing.
You can watch the whole video from Bloomberg Originals at Bloomberg.com.
Up next, our C-Suite Saturday special. We're firing up the grill for Memorial Day. Get ready. It's Bloomberg This Weekend. We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And NASCAR fans, they are remembering driver Kyle Busch. Now, Busch died 3 days before he was set to run the Coca-Cola 600 at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. NASCAR CEO Steve O'Donnell paid tribute.
I think personally about Kyle Busch and NASCAR. And to me, Kyle Busch just defines what it means to be a racer in NASCAR. Everything about it, the fire, the greatness, the heart that sometimes you rarely saw. The sport was truly lucky to have him.
That cause of death has not been released. Busch was 41 years old. to golf now, where the PGA Tour hits TPC Craig Ranch in McKinney, Texas. Siwoo Kim, he tops the leaderboard at 18 under par, followed by a 5-way tie for second. And that includes Americans Scotty Scheffler, Wyndham Clark, and Jackson Suber at 13 under par. Some NHL playoff action last night. The Vegas Golden Knights, well, they topped the Colorado Avalanche 3-1 in Game 2. Tonight, the Montreal Canadiens take the Carolina Hurricanes. Basketball time. The Oklahoma City Thunder, well, they beat the San Antonio Spurs 123-108 in Game 3 of the Western Conference Finals last night. The Thunder leads the series 2-1, and tonight, that's the big game. The New York Knicks, they take on the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Knicks lead that series 2-0, meaning 0. And Lionel Messi has joined the exclusive club of athletes with a net worth above $1 billion. Now, his fortune had soared through a massive paycheck from, yes, Inter Miami, but also real estate and stakes in several companies, and that puts him right alongside rival Cristiano Ronaldo. $1 billion.
$1 billion. Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate that update. I'm going to handle this intro as Christina
I'm eating chicken.
Memorial Day, marking the unofficial start of summer, and for many Americans, that means backyard cookouts, road trips, and burgers on the grill. I guess it means.
Sorry, you're gonna have to do my part too because I'm chewing.
All right,
sorry,
as restaurants across the country prepare for one of the busiest stretches of the year, we have Patrick Conlin, president of Wayback Burgers, here with us on set in New York. He's brought a bevy of burgers, chicken nuggets. What is this light? What is this fluorescent blue drink we've got? Hoist that up.
That is blue raspberry lemonade.
I don't think that color is found in nature, but I'm excited to find
excited
that.
to have it.
That's to celebrate America's 250th anniversary.
Let me just ask you first a broad question just about how the burger biz is doing. We hear a lot of talk of the K-shaped economy. Obviously, a lot of people under strain because of rising energy prices. How is the business doing in light of all of that? How's the consumer doing as you see him and her?
It's doing well. I mean, it was a little slow last year and coming into this year, but our sales at Wayback have been up since March. And people love burgers. It's just a nostalgic feel, and this weekend starts really the kickoff, like you mentioned earlier, for the burger season.
Where are you guys most located, and where are your big markets? Are there specific places where you're seeing people are really going all in on fast food again?
Well, we're fast casual, so a little bit.
Fast casual, apologies.
A little bit higher quality, nicer atmosphere, better experience. We may have a relationship with the guests, but we're in 35 states across the U.S. Big concentration in the Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, and we just opened up in our 35th state. We just opened up in Iowa a couple of weeks ago.
But fast casual had a bit of a slump too for a minute there. Are you seeing a rebound, or did that impact you? I mean, I know we joke there are the slot bowl places like Chipotle and Cava and anything that comes in a bowl was having a really hard time. Did you see that slump as well, or did you feel like you guys were in a good sweet spot where it's a product everybody knows, but in a slightly, as you say, elevated place to be?
Yeah, we saw it. I mean, no question that the consumers were looking for a value, but value is also a better product. So we did some things late last year to enhance a value proposition for the guests that come into our restaurants, and continue that today.
What did you do?
We did some meal deals. And we introduced wraps for a short time, limited time offer, which was a lower priced item.
Okay.
And then just recently we introduced the chicken nuggets, even though we're a burger chain. And I think you're enjoying those on Memorial Day weekend.
As someone who doesn't eat beef, I appreciate the chicken nuggets, so I'm here for
breakfast nugget, Lisa.
Let's talk about this beef because I mean this is.
Can we zoom in on that? It's a hearty
this
burger.
Is a hearty burger,
Yes.
okay? And I know, I go to the supermarket, I slap burgers on the grill. They're not cheap nowadays.
No?
They've gone up in price. So how are you guys
She is our Bloomberg
dealing
This
with
Weekend
that?
protein correspondent.
I am about
that
to
is
take a
accurate.
nice
This one
bite
needs
of
a lot of protein.
But they're not cheap, and the prices have gone up. So how do you deal with that? Do you have to pass the price on to the consumer? How are you working it?
You have to pass some of the price on to the consumer, but sometimes you may have to eat a little bit of it. We've been very lucky with our beef supplier that this year there was a minimal increase, so it didn't hurt our franchisees, and we didn't really pass a large price increase on to the consumer in 2026.
I've got a question just about, please, Lisa, take your time. Keep
It's okay, it's not like you're on
keep
television.
the camera trained on Lisa for that one.
Oh my goodness.
We have seen maybe not one of your direct competitors, a fast food chain that has a king as a mascot, do a very public campaign saying they're reinventing themselves, reinventing what the burger is and how it's cooked and what people think they're getting there. In the industry broadly, how much does that happen? I mean, you're holding on to a lot of nostalgia, the way things have been. People go to you for a certain reason. When you introduce something like wraps or chicken nuggets, how much thought do you put into branching out into something that people might not know you for? And is there a chance that as you move away from your core business, that could backfire?
Sure. We have to be very careful about what we introduce that is not one of our core items. And we do a lot of research throughout the year of what's trending. We don't look to be the trendiest restaurant company out there, but we want to look at what's on trend. So we'll look at things like chicken nuggets. We'll look at the wraps as a value proposition.
Yeah.
Are we ever going to bring in some crazy, really out of the box item? I don't think so.
Quinoa bowls.
Yeah, probably not.
Okay.
No tofu.
We're still,
okay.
Even though we have chicken on our menu, we're
Sure.
still 85% of our entrees are burgers.
Beef. Okay.
Yeah.
Margins in the restaurant business are legendarily thin. As you look at the year, obviously we're Bloomberg and we talk about money and economics, and what's going on in the Middle East impacts everything. The downstream effect is going to happen. I don't know if you've seen that yet, but we're going into planting seasons where farmers are going to have to pay more for fertilizer. I know you have transportation costs, that's fuel. What are you worried about? What are you looking at? Where are you kind of already seeing those prices spike?
So far, we haven't seen anything spike. We lock into the majority of our core items that we sell in the restaurants are locked in on yearly contracts.
Okay. So
that we do before the beginning of the year. So we're good for this year, unless there's a fuel surcharge could happen from the food distributor to the restaurant, which would $1 or $2 a delivery. So not a huge impact yet. The more concern is the impact on the consumer coming into the restaurant, and if you're paying X amount more for gas today, are you going to cut back on what you're going to eat?
Yeah.
So so far, knock wood, it hasn't affected us. I think it more affects people in coffee business, and you can cut out going out and getting a coffee a couple of days a week or an ice cream cone. You still have to eat lunch. You still have to eat dinner.
Pat, I go back to something you said at the top, which is the start of burger season. So we have this conceit here, Memorial Day, people are out grilling as season starts. Is that borne out in your business? Is there a seasonality to the fast casual business, or do you see kind of a constant trend of customers throughout the year?
The constant trend, really, our business starts picking up right after Valentine's Day and goes through October, and then the holidays dip down a little bit, and then we wait for Valentine's Day again.
I have to ask about the chicken.
I was just waiting for that to happen.
Thank you.
I'm glad that Christina.
Well, tell us how the burger is.
How's the burger?
The burger's phenomenal, but you mentioned chicken. So is that more pressure? Because we hear about the chicken wars, everything between Chick-fil-A and the Popeyes. Like, that's the big thing. Was that the pressure you felt to kind of bring, or did it come from your customers and said, what?
Or is it annoying people like me who can't eat beef and still want to come to the door?
Good point. We didn't want to be, even though we're Wayback Burgers, we didn't want to be solely that narrowly focused on burgers, because if there's people in an office of 4 people and 3 people want to go for burgers and one person says, I had a burger yesterday, or I don't eat burgers, they could sway the other 3 people. So we wanted to have, we didn't want to get that veto vote. So we wanted to have, we've always had chicken on our menu. We used to have chicken, we have a chicken sandwich and we had chicken tenders. But then one of our longtime vendors came to us with a whole meat chicken nugget, and it's a whole white breast meat. So I couldn't stop eating them when we tested them in the office.
Whoever put these in front of me is in trouble. We got about 30 seconds before we let go. What's your favorite menu item? What's the thing you like to eat?
My favorite menu item is either the classic that you're eating today, the Wayback Classic, or usually any one of our LTO burgers, limited time offer burgers that we come out with. We just came off a sweet and spicy melt, which was a double patty burger with pepper jack cheese and a pineapple jam.
All right,
Pat Conlin, thank you very much for coming in. Thanks for bringing all this. If Lisa drinks this blue drink, that'll really be something to behold. So we'll see. We'll update you after the break. When we come back, we're going to play Pointed, our news quiz. That's coming up here on Bloomberg this weekend on Bloomberg TV.
All right, welcome back. Now for this weekend's
Have you had that drink yet? Either of you?
No.
No.
She's going for it.
Now for this weekend's Pointed News Quiz. It's tasty. It's very sweet. I also have my emotional sport French fries. Lisa is going to go through our pointed news quiz, and I am going to try to retain my streak of beating David Gura.
I think that streak's been broken in recent weeks.
It's not been good. It's not been a good run. So, Lisa, I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you.
Regain.
I'm gonna hook you up. Okay.
2 women on the show. I need you to like telepath me some answers.
Girl
here.
power. Okay, here we go. 3 categories. Are you ready? If you're playing at home, we ask them 3 categories. They have 30 chips in front of them, and they place their bets depending on how confident they feel about each category. All right, so the first category is retail.
Retail, okay.
Second is crypto, and third is obituaries.
Obituaries.
Yes.
Ending on a high note, Lisa.
Now, you've had this like streak where you go 10 across the board.
Yeah,
and
I'm
it's
going to
been
stick
working
with
for
that,
you.
I think. It's
Yeah,
the
because
Ruffini,
it wasn't working, and now that he's stolen my
Ruffini
tactic,
strategy,
he's beating me.
and I'm going to emulate it thus because it actually has boosted my confidence greatly, and I've won, I think, 2 weeks in a row.
I have emotional support, French fries. You can't hurt me today. Lisa, what we got?
Okay, let's start with retail. Okay?
Retail.
Chinese e-commerce giant Haan is acquiring which San Francisco-based retailer for $100 million?
I feel like David knows this one too, unfortunately.
No, you were just talking about this the other day.
I know women.
I literally was.
I do know
pitched a
women.
segment on this. Yeah.
This is like the fight in my house. I say Haan. My daughter says, no, it's Sheen. No, it's Haan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Correct.
I'm
Mama's
gonna
always right.
Be on
Here's the
Mama Mateo over here.
Mama Mateo's
yes,
correct.
Okay.
Let's flip it and see if you guys. Everlane, very good.
Everlane,
yes,
both.
you both
Thank you.
have it.
Both
They're
have
buying
it.
it for about $100 million.
Tell me about this brand because
Less
I
than its
confess
peak
I don't
value.
know what Everlane is.
It was really big a
started in
couple
San
years ago,
Francisco.
and its big thing was sustainable fashion, and it's gotten less and less sustainable, and the quality, in my opinion, as someone who used to buy it, has gone down a lot, and now they are selling to
Fast
one of
fashion.
the most legendarily
Fast fashion.
unsustainable
Very
companies.
good.
Yeah. I know the buzzwords.
You're doing so well. It's
Excellent.
a very
So
controversial.
are you sad about this? You're sad about that. Well,
I stopped shopping there a couple years
your
ago, as
stages
did
of
most
grief have surpassed this already.
as did most of my friends. So good luck to them.
Your
in their
daughter
new
go to
market.
Everlane?
We've got Shin packages coming to
All the
our
way
door
from
all the time.
Shenzhen and other
Yes, I know.
far-flung cities in China. All right.
It is. All right, you want to go to crypto?
Absolutely.
You feeling confident?
I'm feeling so
You feeling good?
confident. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Before Bitcoin Depot had filed for bankruptcy, it was once North America's largest operator of which crypto transaction tool? What's the name of that tool?
Because I thought this was
that
so
thing?
weird.
Yes.
Crypto transaction tool.
Yes. The largest operator of which crypto
I don't
transaction
know.
tool?
All right, whatever. Fine. All right.
You want to try it?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Blockchain.
Blockchain? No, Christina?
ATMs.
Yes,
Oh,
it is.
wow.
Is it that
telling
people
you.
just don't need it to be cash anymore?
They were the largest operator of crypto ATMs.
You know,
It's-
I've always enjoyed seeing those and wonder who actually uses them.
Apparently, no one.
I don't. They're just saying the business model is not sustainable anymore. So.
Well, I
When's
could
the
have told
last
them
time you
that.
used an
Nobody asked
ATM?
me. I use an ATM all the time.
I do.
I don't use like a Bitcoin ATM though.
But exactly.
You guys carry cash like regularly?
Yeah, you know, you got a tip.
Couple bucks for tips.
My
exactly.
kid goes to lunch. I have to pay for his out to lunch.
In cash?
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
my
Oh, my
card.
daughter just
Look at-
uses the Apple Pay
Oh no!
tap.
See, that's
Brooklyn.
a slippery,
Brooklyn.
slippery slope. We got to learn how to tell time. We talked about that earlier with an
Yes.
analog watch, and you got to learn how to count your change,
I think
or you
that's
can be
smart.
taken advantage of in a
No,
retail
it is
setting.
good.
This is a good point. All right. We're even.
Sorry, I lost that one. Take those 10.
Oh, no. Oh, no, you lost. Oh, yes.
you
I
Yeah,
lost.
sorry. Yeah, I don't
Okay,
want, I
that's
don't want
right.
the count to be
All right,
unfair.
Christina. You're up.
Lisa.
Okay, here we go.
Obituaries.
This
I'm
one.
not feeling good about this card.
Okay. Obituaries, here we go. Democratic Representative Barney Frank died on May 20th.
okay.
Frank.
What year was he first elected to Congress?
Well, that's ridiculous.
Lisa.
Okay, it was an easier question, but they changed it to make it harder for you guys.
Control room.
What year? Okay?
Okay.
I can accept 2 answers.
Two
I have
answers.
absolutely no idea.
What does that mean?
If you get close to it, maybe I'll throw you a chip
right.
or 2.
Okay, great. I'm ready. 1978.
I
78?
said 1987.
Oh, it's 1980. Also, I would have accepted
I feel very
81,
close. This is like
okay?
if we were a competing game show.
I know. Well,
I got the lower number. You know, it's like the $1.
Just give her your chips.
So the election, it was actually in 1980. He began the term in January 3rd, 1981. So either one I would have taken.
Well,
who do we got here? Closing. Okay, Christina's up.
All right, we got a bonus.
We got the
question now.
bonus, and it's beauty, girl. Yes. Sorry, David.
I can't wait. We'll get Elena Pepina back. We'll do like an investigation of the dramatic collusion that's been happening in this game. I
Just
feel like we'll get
because
the
you're
we'll get the
losing doesn't
equities
mean
team
I'm
in
cheating.
here.
Lisa, continue.
We're happy.
continue.
We got burgers and fries. Beauty. Okay, South Korean beauty giant What Young is coming
What?
to the U.S. Its name contains a food that comes in manzanilla variety.
Oh. Well,
Wait, that comes in what?
It comes in a manzanilla variety.
I have absolutely no idea.
So beauty giant, blank, young.
Okay.
Okay.
No, that doesn't. I know. I didn't know.
I feel I'm gonna write.
It's coming to the
how about
US.
Face beauty?
No. Oh, she's erasing.
Oh.
She's erasing. Wait.
Blank,
No, you
young?
can't erase. You showed yours already.
I'm done.
Soul?
Soul. No. Olive young.
Olive.
Nope.
Manzanilla
Yeah,
olives.
No.
Nothing but
no
happy
takers.
to have some more K
Korean beauty, man. I know. More K beauty.
All right.
Coming,
Well,
so.
we're gonna forget this happened, but I'm gonna blame it on
Christina is
this
the
fluorescent
champion.
soda that you guys
I'm
have been
going to
drinking
put
here.
my neon orange tips for our
And I
radio
have
listeners next to my
plenty.
neon blue soda, and I'm going to take a victory sip.
There we go.
We're gonna check your
Lisa,
sugar levels.
thank you
in a
very
moment.
much.
I'm going back to my burger.
All right, you enjoy. You can test your knowledge on all 10 questions. If these 3 weren't enough, there are 7 more. You can take the Pointed News quiz at Bloomberg.com/pointed.
And remember, they are multiple choice online, so it is quite a bit easier than the way we embarrass ourselves here every Sunday.
I give you guys a lot of credit. These are tough.
It makes it a little bit harder. All
Credit
right.
taken.
Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. We will be back here tomorrow. We hope you all join us starting 7 a.m. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo for our listeners on Bloomberg Radio. Masters in Business, Barry Ritholtz is up next for our TV audience. Wall Street Week with David Weston. That starts right now.